Hello, my name is Helena Gaspard. I'm the Director of Governance and Institutions at the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy at the University of Ottawa. Welcome to Day 2 of the Recovery Summit. Today, we'll be addressing the themes of shared prosperity and inclusive societies. Globally, the economic outlook is grim, with trade, employment, and GDP projected to decline well into the second half of 2020. We know this pandemic has affected everyone, but not always in the same way. Inequalities for minorities, including women, have been exacerbated. These challenges, however, can be opportunities to make decisions to support long-term economic growth, sustainability, and inclusivity. We'll be hearing from a number of practitioners, politicians, and thinkers on their ideas for shared prosperity and inclusive growth for a better way forward. You can ask questions of the panel today by going to slido.com and be sure to use the hashtag #RecoverySummit, all one word, to be taken to the dedicated Q&A page. Questions are typically taken in the last 15 minutes of the panel. Ahead of today's discussions, we have a special opening message for you from the Canadian Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry, the Honourable Navdeep Bains.
First and foremost, thank you to Helena Gaspard for that warm introduction, and thank you to the Honourable Anne McClellan and Sadiq Khan for chairing these discussions on such important subjects. I am grateful to be asked to present remarks at the Recovery Project's Recovery Summit. It's been quite a year, and in spite of all the challenges we faced, I've been consistently impressed and moved by the effort and compassion shown by Canadians in light of this major disruption to our lives. Time and time again, I've watched Canadians step up, retool, research, and design our way out of this crisis. You have shown just how far you're willing to go to be there for your neighbors, and for that, I applaud this country. The Recovery Project is no different. It was built on a foundation of evidence, sustained effort, and common purpose to provide resources, insight, and analysis for what comes next. The project has brought together an impressive list of contributors from across the country and abroad who are sharing their insights on how to achieve sustainable, lasting recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. No doubt your efforts will be invaluable as we move forward as a country and begin to gradually restore our economy. When the COVID-19 pandemic arrived in Canada, we put out a call to Canadian companies to retool, to source materials and goods we needed to fight the virus here at home. Thousands of companies reached out, and the result has been the largest procurement project in Canadian history. In dollar terms, we went from sourcing basically 0% of our PPE here to sourcing over 40% of it in Canada. We also understand that our best defense against the spread of the virus is in our communities with science, and we made historic investments in vaccine research, treatments, and testing, including sourcing the required materials so that Canada could lead the world in the search for life-saving solutions to COVID-19. These initiatives came together to create the Made in Canada project, a full-court press approach to sourcing materials here at home when big challenges arise. We want to make sure that Canada is amply prepared should another pandemic or any other major challenge, such as climate change, require similarly coordinated approach. We now know what Canadian companies and researchers are capable of. We know where our investments and our big ideas can take us as we focus on our economic recovery and our future as a nation. Those big ideas will be vital to our success. Turning to the important subject of today's discussion, we also understand that economic recovery cannot fully be accomplished if it does not include all Canadians. The first step in taking on systemic inequity is to understand it better. That's why, beginning with the 2021 census, Canada will begin collecting data on a number of new previously underrepresented members of our society. The new census will gather information on the experiences of ethnic minorities, LGBTQ2 Canadians, minority language right holders, veterans, and Indigenous Canadians. This data will allow our government to make better, more inclusive decisions when it comes to public policy. Similarly, our government is deeply committed to promoting equity in the workplace. Last mandate, we passed Bill C-25, a catalyst for promoting diversity on corporate boards and management teams, because we understand that better decisions are made when everyone is welcome at the decision-making table. We are currently working diligently to advance this policy even further, because it's just not the right thing to do, but also makes the most business sense. As a final example of our commitment to equitable recovery, we recently launched Canada's first ever Black Entrepreneurship Program. As a response to the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on Black Canadians, this program will help thousands of Black business owners and entrepreneurs across the country recover from this crisis and grow their businesses. As I've said throughout my career, the best and most successful Canadian economy is one that reflects the diversity of our incredible country. I look forward to hearing your insights today and better understanding the ways in which we can make our economic recovery more equitable and fair. Once again, thank you for having me and enjoy the conference.
Thank you, Minister Bains, for your kind words. It has indeed been quite the year, and it's been inspiring to see Canadians come together. To get us thinking about shared prosperity, you'll see a series of TED-style videos compiled for the summit. You'll hear idea pitches now from Nils Gilman, the Vice President of Programs at the Berggruen Institute, Heather Boushey, the President, CEO, and co-founder of the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, Matthew Mendelsohn, visiting professor at Ryerson University, and Sasha Kerstich, the President of MasterCard Canada.
In recent years, America has been increasingly burdened by economic stagnation, pervasive inequality, and financial fragility. 40% of adults in the United States don't have $400 to spare in an emergency. It's no wonder that an average of 1 million Americans a year declare personal bankruptcy. Without universal provisioning of health, disability, and retirement benefits, anyone's household's wealth can be destroyed by a random personal calamity. One proposal that has garnered much public attention for addressing this has been universal basic income. UBI entails unconditional government payments that are sufficient to meet every person's basic needs. By ensuring that every individual reaches a minimum income threshold, UBI raises the floor. On the other hand, universal basic capital is a pre-distribution mechanism designed to address a related but different problem: wealth inequality. By helping individuals to grow their personal wealth, UBC goes beyond basic income support to ensure that everyone owns a fair share of the economy's assets. UBC provides crucial economic security. One's assets serve as a buffer in times of income fluctuation or personal emergencies. Having a liquid and protected safety net to fall back on also puts workers in a fair bargaining position, which will help them to increase their wages. UBC consists of a series of ideas, such as baby bonds. Bonds from birth funded directly out of the Treasury and held in account by the federal government, similar to Social Security. A postal banking system, and guaranteed high-yield savings accounts that are managed by a postal bank, or a set of guaranteed accounts at the Federal Reserve. Government retirement accounts, administered by either the Treasury or Federal Reserve as a pooled pension plan. GRAs would be individually owned accounts, returning individual contributions just like a 401k. A public financial system that creates baby bonds, low-cost universal savings instruments, and guaranteed retirement accounts provides the basis for a necessary and effective personal wealth accumulation strategy that makes sense for the economy of the 21st century. Capitalism has conquered the world. But now it needs to be reimagined so that everyone can have a fair stake in the future.
Thank you very much to the organizers for having me here today. We have learned over the past decade that prosperity, as measured by GDP or unemployment rates or stock market valuations, is not enough. It is not enough to provide working people with the economic security they require, and it is not enough to avert the collapse and unraveling of democratic societies. The current federal government ran in 2015 on shared prosperity, on inclusive growth. It was exactly the right goal then, it remains so today, and it was resisted 5 years ago by the same people who are today resisting, addressing well-known, long-standing policy shortcomings that leave working Canadians vulnerable to a variety of systemic risks. 5 years ago, they said, don't run a deficit, don't increase transfers to low and middle income families and take away benefits from upper income people. Don't increase premiums to more generously fund the Canada Pension Plan. They were wrong then, and they are even more wrong now. The shared prosperity agenda needs to be deepened with actionable, practical policies and programs that can deliver working people with more economic security. So I have two pitches today, one about public policy and income security, one about public administration. On policy, if progressives want to capitalize on this moment, we must keep it simple, use existing tools that deliver a real impact on people's lives, and that don't indulge in magical thinking. My policy pitch is that there are three things that will deliver economic security far better than pursuing a universal basic income, which is not a viable way to seize this moment and turn ideas into programs that make a difference in people's lives over the next 12 months. The three things that are a better use of our resources are targeted cash transfers, improved social services, and legislation that improves the quality of work. You first use existing mechanisms that already function like a universal basic income for most Canadians to get cash to people in a targeted way. The Canada Child Benefit, the Canada Workers Benefit, the Guaranteed Income Supplement, the Canada Student Grant, disability supports. As we saw, they can be quickly increased based on circumstances. The current government has reformed each of these in the past 5 years to make them more progressive and improve their impact on things that matter, like child poverty. They are easy, elastic, adaptable, deliverable, and they exist. The most important new thing is to add to our suite of income support programs is the formalization of a CERB-like vehicle to act as insurance for those outside the EI system, because childless working age adults are really the only group of Canadians that does not have a program which functions like a UBI. 2, spend more on public services, both existing and new. These serve as a social wage and make life more affordable and more secure. Prioritize by choosing one or two. My preferences are for childcare and home care in partnership with community and civil society organizations. But governing is about making choices, and others will choose other things. 3, we must act on ensuring that gig and low-wage workers have better quality employment. Again, progressive provincial governments have made progress on employment standards, the right to organize minimum wage, the misclassification of gig workers, and other issues, but they remain under threat. And federally, there are off-the-shelf solutions in the form of the expert panel on modern federal employment standards that can be implemented. We need to focus on practical, adaptable, existing solutions that can be scaled and calibrated and complemented in targeted ways, and that will last. And second, from a public finance and administration perspective, addressing our policy challenges is more difficult because of a pathology in public budgeting and financing. We only count how much things cost. If we spend $1 billion on early childhood education, or literally take $1 billion in $100 bills and set them on fire, they are both reported in the same way. We spent $1 billion. So we need more sophisticated understanding of outcomes, of return on investment, and of longer-term impact. The current federal government has taken some steps in this direction with gender-based budgeting. GBA analysis explicitly recognized that a positive impact on GDP is not good enough if it has negative impacts on vulnerable communities. But the point of GBA Plus that has not received sufficient public attention is that in order to understand whether a measure has a differentiated impact on different groups, you first have to know its impact, not just its cost. And that is not usually a part of budgeting. So, to summarize and tie these 2 points together, if we fail to improve our capacity to understand impact and the economic and social returns of our spending, if we only count the immediate costs of things like childcare and not their long-term returns, it will be much more difficult to address the long-standing policy gaps that this moment requires, and it will be more difficult to deliver real shared prosperity. Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Heather Boushey. I'm President and CEO of the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. High economic inequality is a problem in good times, but it is particularly stark in this crisis. In the United States, it has amplified the severity of both the pandemic as well as the economic downturn. For decades, policymakers and economists alike have put their faith in the idea that markets are the best and only way for our economy to deliver what's needed for sustained economic growth and well-being. This promise has not delivered. We've seen economic resources become increasingly concentrated among those at the top of the income and wealth ladder. And we've seen how this concentration of resources transforms into social and political power among an elite few. Still, we pretend that the rules that govern markets are always neutral and fair. But allowing markets to determine outcomes has shifted economic risk towards people and families and away from the institutions that could better bear them. Our economic competitors have fared better than we because they have effective institutions. At the same time, we in the United States have reduced the risks for those at the top, including big corporations. At no time has this been more apparent than right now. Today, many of the workers most likely to be in jobs with a high degree of face-to-face contact with the public, jobs like the restaurant staff who prepare our food, and the healthcare workers who care for us when we are sick, are at greater risk of exposure to the coronavirus. They are also less likely to have access to paid sick time or employer-provided health insurance. Meanwhile, if you're in a job where you can telecommute, you're also more likely to have the best insurance coverage and the most generous workplace benefits. In other words, the deck is stacked. This is what inequality looks like, and it plays out across gender, across race and income level. When Wall Street gets a cold, Harlem gets pneumonia. Death rates are higher in communities of color, in no small part due to structural racism, segregation, and industrial policy. This is on top of underlying health inequalities due to a failure to invest in ensuring all communities have access to high-quality and affordable health care. And it's clear that the jobs that make it possible for those with families to go to work every day, childcare centers, schools, nursing homes, are also heavily staffed by women and are among the least paid. Because of these underlying structural fragilities, the economic crisis is being felt more dramatically in the United States than in our economic competitors. Congress allowed critical legislation providing support to families and small businesses to expire, and it is exacerbating already historic levels of inequality. If large businesses continue to receive seamless and generous help during the coronavirus recession, but small businesses are left with laggard or inadequate assistance, we will see increases in already severe levels of economic inequality, including wealth disparities by race, ethnicity, and gender. And we will see consolidation and concentration across firms, which will hurt small business owners, consumers, and workers. Unless policymakers actively address these structural issues, the United States will experience continued increases in income and wealth inequality amid the coronavirus recession and coming out of it. This is exactly what happened after the Great Recession, when the U.S. economy lost 8.7 million jobs and $12 trillion in total household net worth. The wealthiest 1% emerged stronger than ever, They regained what they had lost by 2012. That year, their inflation-adjusted average wealth, not including any funds hidden in overseas accounts, was $13.8 million, just 3.5% below the 2007 peak. Middle-class families, meanwhile, were still recovering in March of this year. The role of policy changes in arranging our market structure are unmistakable and enduring. We must seek to enact policies that contain inequality at the top and provide counterweights to concentrated economic power, not amplify it. And we must ask tough questions to make the tough choices. Will we again choose to bail out Wall Street rather than Main Street? Or will we use antitrust enforcement agencies to ensure small businesses have a chance? Will we make it easier or harder to join a union? Will we make sure no worker has to show up for work sick or in fear for their health, and that if you need care, you'll have access to it? These are the critical policy questions facing the United States, ones that require we confront economic inequality and all it has done to our economy and our society. Thank you.
The economic turmoil created by the pandemic is severe and its scope is still being understood. Unlike in 2008, when male workers were deeply affected, we're seeing an economic crisis that disproportionately affects female workers, with women facing job losses and economic hardship in greater numbers than men. In fact, an RBC study suggests that female participation in the labor force has dropped to its lowest level in 3 decades. This is a generational change, but not the type of change we aspire to. The tools used to boost economies in past recessions, such as infrastructure funding, will be less applicable to address the current context. And therein lies our challenge. How do governments and private sector address an economic situation they have never experienced before? Addressing this gap and using new policy tools is critical, because without capturing these lost jobs among women, the recovery will not be felt evenly and the economy will not operate to its full potential. This gets at the very core of concepts of shared prosperity and inclusive growth, which have been part of the MasterCard vision and mission for years, well before this most recent pandemic and economic crisis. We formalized this commitment with the establishment of the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth in 2013 to advance equitable and sustainable growth and financial inclusion globally. The pandemic has shone new light on these issues. You saw it in giant lineups at big box retailers or in the surge in online sale for some mainstream brands, while many of our independent stores on local main streets were boarded up for months. Sadly, many have not survived, and many more are at risk. You also see it in women and youth unemployment, 2 demographics that have been particularly hard hit. The pandemic has wrought many thorny problems, but because advancing economic opportunities for women is a personal priority for me, that is the one I propose to tackle. It is already critical to financial inclusion, and it is even more so now. As a first step, it is imperative that we get every single business safely online and digital. At a minimum, that should be a shared goal of governments and the private sector. But that is not my big idea. Call that one a big necessity. If you can get businesses to go digital, that is where big ideas and opportunities lie. The internet allows a business anywhere in the world to connect with a consumer anywhere else in the world. Buy local and buy green initiatives have been successful. So why not create a policy framework to support women entrepreneurs via a buy female marketplace with initiatives to support, grow, and amplify female-led small businesses? That's my big idea. Each year, MasterCard conducts a global survey of women entrepreneurs. This report confirms that gender inequality is ubiquitous, but manifests across different countries and markets in different ways. It also reveals that even markets with high overall index scores still have other gender disparities to contend with, such as the income gap between women and men business owners. Entrepreneurs are the lifeblood of our economy. Let's support them in a targeted way to drive the recovery in an equitable fashion. Individual marketplaces can be started at the country level and connect to a global network through an entity like the OECD, sharing best practices. Developed countries could then earmark a proportion of development funding for similar initiatives around the world, in line with the focus on gender in the development policy of progressive nations. Effectively, build it locally, expand it globally. By taking this buy female concept a step further, We could also create a digital investment component of the marketplace for businesses not yet off the ground, where female entrepreneurs could pitch ideas in hopes of attracting investors, building on the success of entities like SheEO, the Elevate Network, and the What Now, What Next marketplace. These are discrete examples of such initiatives at the country or company level, but by creating an international network and policy focus, these efforts can be leveraged to much more significant scale. With this framework and network in place, it offers opportunities for larger companies and governments to engage even further. For example, as part of their CSR mandates or huge dollar values associated with procurement policies, multinationals and governments could set a goal for buying from this marketplace. Large companies should play a role, either through procurement, startup mentoring, or even direct investment. For example, why not set a goal of devoting a percentage of profits to be invested in female-led startups, or a target of buying from women-owned businesses? Governments could also assist through tilting a portion of their economic development time and budgets to curating business ideas in this investment portal, drawing on the expertise of entrepreneurs in existing networks like SheEO. MasterCard has a history of building meaningful public-private partnerships. We've created solutions for millions of women entrepreneurs in developed and developing economies using our digital technology to drive financial inclusion for all. Earlier this year, we redoubled our efforts with a direct focus on providing 25 million women entrepreneurs with solutions that can help them enter the digital economy and grow their business. By leveraging resources of multinational companies and governments to support women entrepreneurs, working together, we can recover from this crisis because we know that when women work, economies grow. Thank you.
I am the Summit co-chair for Shared Prosperity. I am also the former Deputy Prime Minister of Canada and a senior advisor at the law firm of Bennett Jones LLP. First, let me give a big thank you to our 4 idea pitchers this morning. The pitches identify challenges, most of which pre-existed COVID-19, but all of which have been magnified by COVID-19. Pre-existing structural barriers to inclusive and equitable participation in global economies have been starkly revealed. One thing is clear: those who were marginalized and struggling before COVID-19 are further negatively impacted because of COVID-19. But does this global pandemic provide us with the opportunity to build back better? And I realize not everybody out there accepts that phrase, but it is one that I will use this morning. One senses momentum for change, a desire to identify the gaps in our social programs, the barriers to access to education that prepares one for the digital, automated economy of the future, and the limitations of markets to create and share prosperity in an inclusive and equitable way. Governments have announced trillions of dollars in relief, but how do we translate that into a shared recovery? One that promotes economic growth, sustainability, and inclusion. And to do any of that efficiently and effectively, we need better information, better data collection, which will provide the evidence that governments, the private sector, and civil society need to choose the best tools by which to build back better. With that, I am pleased to introduce my fellow panelists. Farah Mohammed is Senior Vice President, Toronto Region Board of Trade. She is the former CEO of the Malala Foundation and founder of the Girls G20, a global organization to cultivate female leaders. Jim Chalmers is the MP for Rankin in the Australian Labor Party and is the shadow treasurer in the official opposition. And Jim, as I mentioned, I love the way you introduce yourself sometimes, a scrapper from Logan City. Miguel Matos is a member of parliament in the Socialist Party parliamentary group for the Lisbon area, and Miguel, I believe, the youngest member of parliament to ever be elected. and you are a former economic advisor to Prime Minister Antonio Costa. Welcome to you all.
Good morning.
Now, we have one small housekeeping matter before we get into this. We will be taking questions toward the last 15 minutes of our panel. To ask questions, please go to Slido, S-L-I-D-O, slido.com, and use the hashtag Recovery Summit to be taken to our dedicated Q&A page. So let's get started, everyone. The same question for each one of you right now. As you all know, when we're in the midst of a crisis or a traumatic event, human nature is such that we say we are going to learn lessons, we're going to take those lessons seriously, and we are going to make things better. I think it's fair to say all four of us either have been elected or have worked in government over an extensive period of time. I think we have all seen that, in fact, that desire to build back better doesn't always come to fruition. Do you think, coming out of COVID-19, this global pandemic, do you think that we actually will take the opportunity to make fundamental transformative change? And if you do, why? And why don't I start with you, Miguel?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much to Canada 2020 and Global Progress for putting this together. And thanks a lot for the invitation. It's a real honor to be here with such a distinguished panel of speakers and many people whose work I admire. I mean, I think this time really is different. I mean, we say this every single time when there's a crisis, but really, if we look at this crisis, this time is different. First of all, because of the huge depth and intensity of this crisis. I mean, we just didn't have the sheer scale of job losses the previous time we had a crisis, namely in 2008. And also, it's different in the kind of job losses we have. I mean, in the previous crisis, as some of the pitchers just said, we had more men losing their jobs than women. Nowadays, it's a bit different. In this crisis, more women are losing their jobs than men. And I think we also have a difference in this crisis in the sense that the financial sector has not been fundamentally affected. And in this sense, we still have a mechanism through which we can work, both in terms of funding government, but also in terms of funding businesses to help us recover. And so the meaning of this is that we both have different commitments to providing a bigger scale of solutions, but we also have more instruments at our disposal than we have before. And we've seen it very clearly, the United States with giving those checks to people, to everybody, the huge amount of furlough schemes across Europe, among a number of other policy instruments, which have been truly groundbreaking. The last sense in which this time is different is that this crisis, the health crisis, which then sparked the economic and social crisis, happened at the same time as two other crises, which really require a response, and which I think require a meaningful and lasting response, which is the climate crisis, very clearly. I mean, in 2008, we were not seeing the kind of forest fires we are seeing today, the kind of natural disasters we are seeing today, and with huge impacts also on the actual value of financial and real economy assets. And also a crisis in democracy, because populists are emerging, far-right populists are emerging all over the place. And really, we need to provide answers now, in the sense that in 2008, we didn't feel this urgency because the establishment and the system and democracy itself was not in question. Now, if we fail, perhaps there might be a question about whether this is the right political system for us. I mean, I think we need to marshal new kinds of solutions. I'm sure we'll go into depth into all of those. I just think that to do that, we need to start considering the politics of how we implement sustainable solutions, increasing the bargaining power of workers, increasing also the laws, making laws a bit more stable and more implementable. And lastly, to change the narrative, to change the Overton's window by looking at headline indicators. Heather Boushey in her pitch just a few minutes ago was talking about how we need to look at different indicators of GDP, well-being GDP. I mean, perhaps we also need to look at other indicators as to a deficit, public deficit. Just a few ideas to shift the balance.
Okay, thank you, Miguel. Farah.
Yeah, so I think Miguel has highlighted a lot of the different issues. I would say it can change if we do a couple of things. So first of all, we have to really admit that we were thrown off our game. Like, we have never been thrown off our game, and not just one person, everybody. It's not left government or business or individuals immune to anything. So one, we've been thrown off our game. Two, we've been exposed to our blind spots, right? We didn't understand just how blind spot we were in terms of home care, nursing care. The third thing I would say is, if we want this to be sustainable, if we really want to see some change, we have to admit that what we have doesn't work for everyone. So I'll give you a very clear example. We in Canada did the right thing, and we put this thing called a COVID alert so that everyone could put it on their iPhone or whatever device they happen to have. That was just a plug for Apple. I didn't mean to do that, but so whatever advice you have. But you have to understand that vulnerable populations don't necessarily use those devices. So how are they supposed to have the same access that everyone else has? So the issue of access has really been brought to bear. You know, we didn't want to leave our houses, but we wanted people that we depend on to leave their houses. So we could go if we wanted to have our groceries delivered. Well, somebody's packing those groceries. Somebody's shopping for that stuff. So I think we have to really understand that, you know, on top of what Miguel has said, we do need political, social, economic changes, number one. We need to recognize our blind spots and really drill down on the solutions. So if we know that healthcare, and but incidentally, healthcare is not, you know, when I worked in government, and I used to work with Anne, and we have, you know, scars to tell around SARS. Yes. Did we learn anything from SARS? I think we did. I think we did learn things, you know, changes were made. But when I come back to, can this be sustainable? If we recognize our blind spots and we drill down on the solutions, then I think things can change. If we we only think about the short game and we don't think about the long term, I don't think anything will change. And I think that's the difference. The last thing I'll say is, what gives me hope is that I've never seen this level of collaboration between government before. Here in Canada, we have the federal government working very closely with the provincial government, working very closely with the municipal government. They may not agree on everything, but they've been present, they've been relatively clear, they've been collaborative. And I think that is what gives me hope, is that that combined with our ability to be quick. I mean, we've accelerated the pace here by 10 or 15 years. And we'll get into some of the things that have been accelerated, but I've never seen this kind of collaboration with this kind of speed. And that's, I think, what gives me hope, both in terms of government, what business has done, and what individuals think they're capable of doing in a time of incredible unknown and a sense of real uncomfortableness. No one knows when this will end.
Thank you. Jim, your perspective on this.
Yeah, thanks very much, Anne and Miguel and Farrar as well for the opportunity to join you on this panel. I think there is a certain nostalgic pull that our political opponents will rely on to pretend that the best that we can hope for is some kind of return to how things were in the pre-COVID economy. And the reason why I have some confidence that we can build back better, as you said in your question, is because the alternative for the great mass of working people around the world is too horrible to contemplate. I think it is equally true, as you intimated in your introduction before, is that we haven't been perfect at learning the lessons of the past. The GFC exposed deep flaws in neoliberalism. This crisis is exposing deep flaws in right-wing populism. Both of those crises exposed ineffective government, and yet the foundations of the political contest are more or less undisturbed. And with some exceptions, including our hosts, of course, those political conditions have not been very kind to us. So I think we do need to recognise that. I think that the point that you made and others have made about the acceleration of some of the things that worried us most in the economy is a really important starting point here. Miguel was right, I think, to point to the fact that we're dealing with a different order of magnitude, and I think a different order of multitude as well. The fact that this crisis is not just impacting the most vulnerable, as important as that is, but also the kind of the middle of our societies as well, means that this is a different crisis than before. The stakes are that much higher. And for all of the talk of kind of unprecedented times, we need to recognise that the conditions in the economies of the developed world in particular before this crisis are the things which will weigh heaviest on our capacity to grow out of it. I also think we need to avoid the trap of considering everything that's being done now, including welcome support by governments of all persuasions in the economy. We need to avoid seeing that just as short-term triage. If we do that, we'll squander the opportunity to build back better. We'll squander the opportunity to find bigger answers to bigger questions. And the risk of that approach is that all we do is we spend hundreds of billions of dollars, if not trillions of dollars, in each of our countries just paying for a return to the inertia of the past. In Australia, the Australian Prime Minister has a term for this, which is called snapback. And he talks about snapping back to how things were before most of us had even heard of coronavirus. That is a very damaging sentiment, in my view. In different countries, we call it different things. But I think it's really clear that if we snap back to whether it's neoliberalism, protectionism, tribalism, nativism, or austerity, that would be a recipe for a deeper downturn, longer unemployment queues, a slower recovery, more damage to budget, more social dislocations, more economic dislocation, and also will mean that we haven't learned the lessons of this extraordinary crisis, and we've squandered the capacity to build back better from it.
So I take it from all three of you that you actually think, because of, let us summarize it, the magnitude of this particular global crisis, that there will be sufficient momentum and political will to actually look at some of the structural problems that we actually all knew existed before COVID-19. Right?
Yeah, I'll take it if you like. Yes.
That's a hopeful way to start our discussion this morning. Maybe from my position of great age, maybe I am just a little bit more concerned about whether we're able to sustain that momentum going forward. But what are the instruments? If we want to bring about some of the kinds of change we heard in the pitches, some of the things that you're talking about, what are the instruments? What are the tools that we have to make this real for the marginalized, for the most vulnerable people in our society? So that we don't, Jim, just snap back to where we were before, but we actually see some fundamental rethinking and political action around some of these big issues, such as is being called for in the 4 pitches. Jim, you've talked a lot about unemployment scarring. This is a big issue in COVID-19. People being detached from the workforce. Some people maybe never coming back. Others, youth, women, interruptions. How do they reconnect with the workforce? What do we need to do there to make meaningful change?
Yeah, a couple of important things about that, Anne. I think Miguel earlier on and you just now made the right reference to the fact that we have to unite the political and the policy. I think there is a tendency, a temptation on the centre left and in the progressive parties of the world to think that automatically our well-researched and accepted in some parts of our society's policy solutions, we need to have some political muscle and some political heft behind that. We also need to recognise that, as I said before, some of the contours of that political contest have not suited us, whether it's kind of neoliberalism versus permanent big state socialism, whether it's right-wing populism versus left-wing populism, whether it's failures of leadership versus a kind of a bloodless, soulless, technocratic status quo centrism. None of those things have delivered the kind of real and meaningful change that we want to see in our economies and in our societies. And so we need to unite the political and the policy. In political, we need to be better at being focused on incomes and work and aspiration and the future. We need to recognise that the coming electoral contests won't just be a referendum on what's been before, but probably more likely a referendum on what the future looks like and what story we can tell there. And also our capacity to show people that the riskier course of action here is to actually go back to all of the job insecurity and financial insecurity and precarious work that defined our economies before the crisis. In policy terms, we need to think about things. Obviously, cleaner and cheaper energy is a big part of it. Training for technology is a big part of it. The whole co-investment agenda in new sources of growth, but also to leverage traditional sources of growth is a big part of it. Obviously, we need to get better. Many of our countries need to get better at commercialising our ideas, turning our ideas into jobs. And then perhaps most impactfully, in terms of marginalised groups and the hardest hit communities in our countries, we need to get better at the place-based approaches, those direct jobs programs in specific areas which are hardest hit. Because to go to the main thing that I think we need to care about the most, the thing that keeps us awake at night, is the idea that this spike in unemployment that we're all seeing will turn into something which becomes long-term unemployment, labour market scarring, where we see that disadvantage concentrate and cascade through the generations. I think that's the main thing that we need to avoid at almost any cost. That's the thing which will cruel not just our economies, but our communities, potentially for the rest of our lives. And so that's the thing we need to focus on most. I think that's a powerful political message, as well as a powerful political challenge that we need to turn our minds to, a policy challenge that we need to turn our minds to.
So Farah, when you think about what Jim has said in terms of unemployment scarring, intergenerational challenges, obviously different tools, different policy approaches for probably different targeted groups. Women, for example, Miguel has mentioned you have been disproportionately impacted in COVID. What do you see as some of the public policy and some of the instruments or tools that government needs to take a look at, needs to change, think about for women? And I know also you've worked a great deal with youth around the world. Youth disproportionately impacted as well during COVID. But let's focus on women right now.
Sure.
Some of the impacts we're seeing are pretty devastating, especially for single moms at home. Where do you think we need to go in terms, and of course that was a problem before COVID.
Yeah.
So where do we need to go to try and fix some of this?
So I think, first of all, we have to really call out some of the assumptions that we've made, right? So Miguel, you said something that was really interesting, is in this particular crisis, women are more affected than men. The reason for that is that more women have gotten further ahead and they're being paid more, so they're being let go faster. In previous crises, men were the larger earners, and so to create this ability to save some money, men were let go. So I think we have to understand why that dynamic is actually happening, number one. Number two, and I'm one who believes that the policy change has to go with a practical solution. So here, we've been talking about childcare for I don't know how long.
Right.
I just don't even understand. I can't even tell you how long we've been talking about childcare, but we know that childcare.
As long as I've been alive, probably.
Yeah, we know, exactly. So I'm not even going to talk about how long that's been, Anne, because I refuse to make age jokes. But no, look, we know that childcare is an issue, and we continue to talk about it, and we have a Band-Aid solution every single time we talk about it. We've never really said structurally, here's what we need to do. And we've never backed that up with the kind of money and partnerships between business and government that we need. So that needs to be a structural, political policy, and then a pragmatic solution to one of the largest issues holding women back from going back into the workforce, number one. Number two, we've seen now lots of companies would never have believed that you can work from home. And this has been a tremendous, again, an acceleration of what we probably would have gotten to maybe 10, 15, 20 years down the road. But it's allowed more women to work from home, to keep their jobs, so that they're able to work from home, do their job, take care of their kids, et cetera, et cetera. The third thing I would say that is affecting, and I'm just going to pivot a little bit to youth now. So in terms of youth, think about being a young person who's gone through 4 years, is now coming out, you've got your degree, you're on to the next stage of your life. And there really isn't a lot of opportunity in terms of further education, because the experience is not going to be the same. You probably don't have the money. Getting a job right now that fits your degree or your passion or whatever the case may be. And then you tack on to that this sort of lost generation mentality. How are we going to keep them engaged? So I think that we have this challenge with women. We have this challenge with young people, and somewhere in between, we need to come up with a really credible way of keeping them in the system. So childcare is one, work from home. Things like broadband should be an essential service. so that people get it no matter where they live. You know, north of just Toronto, you can be 1 kilometer outside of a major city and you don't have the same access. So we need to actually have governments either step up or, you know, I'm a big believer in partnerships between government and business, and we've got to find the way to do that and to do it quickly, because we can't afford to slide back. And then the final thing I'll say is, I think it was Sasha in the MasterCard video that really talked about ensuring that we're investing in women entrepreneurs.
Mm-hmm.
And this is like a really big issue no matter where you live in the world, right? So you could be in Africa and you could be really struggling, but you've got an entrepreneurial spirit. And if somebody gives you a chance to get your product to market, then you're going to do a lot better. So support for female entrepreneurs. Jim, you just said something about getting innovation to market. There's so many incredible innovative ideas, but we don't have the commercial policies. We don't have the industrial, policies now that would help us around innovation. So what stops us is lots of people come up with great ideas. And in Canada's case, unfortunately, a lot of them leave this country because we don't have the commercial landscape to really push those out. So there are a number of different things that I think we can do for women, for young people, really putting an emphasis on entrepreneurship, access to capital, all of the same things we've been talking about for so long, but it's, you know, you sort of have to say enough talk, we need some action. And don't let the analysis, the over-analysis lead us to paralysis, which is, I think, what has happened between crises, right? So we have to think about the time in between the crisis of what we've had and where we can go.
Miguel, are we potentially facing a lost generation of young people in terms, and not only because of COVID, obviously. I think we may have been facing that challenge globally well before COVID, but now it's simply magnified that so many young people have lost jobs. It's not clear those jobs will even come back. Maybe to Farah's point that we've learned how to work differently, do business differently. Where will the jobs come from that next generation of entrepreneurs, and well, entrepreneurs may create their own jobs, but where will the economic growth, where will the jobs come from so that we don't lose a dispirited generation of young people?
I mean, it's a huge risk, the fact that there are so many people, so many young people who are finishing their degree or who are looking to start higher education. And the prospect is just so bleak for them to find jobs. And we need to give them the ability to keep on dreaming and to continue to aspire to a better life. Really, this speaks to the issue of labor market scarring as well, because you can scar in the middle of your professional career. You can also scar in the beginning of your professional career. And what we know from the previous crisis is that a number of young people finished their educations, and then they went to jobs for which they were overqualified, and they ended up in the long term earning less money, even if they then went back to their own careers and professions which they were trained to do. And so really, I think we need to make sure that while people have this interruption of demand, that we are able to fill this with some sort of occupational program, which keep them busy, which keep them integrated into society, which keep them thinking, which keep us working on our skills and on our human capital. I think this is going to be really important as well. And it's going to also provide labor for a number of huge societal challenges, which we have, not only in terms of climate change and digital, but for example, also in the care economy. We have a very big need to address the labor needs of aging. And so, you know, I think there's a huge opportunity for us to provide public interest jobs which occupy people during this period if we want to. On top of it, I mean, I just think we cannot give up on the idea of work. I mean, it's very popular these days to discuss UBI, Universal Basic Income, and issues like that, but all of them come from an assumption that a huge number of people will not be working. And I think we can't give up on the idea of full employment, because really it's when people are in work, they can, feel accomplished, feel like they are working their full potential, and also that they meet other people from other walks of life and other regions. And I think that's really important to make sure that our society doesn't really fall apart and people grow apart from each other. And so I think if we want to continue to provide jobs, we need to make sure that our society continues to invest in a number of public services and infrastructure to continue to provide to businesses and to workers that social safety net, which isn't just NHS. It isn't just social security. It's much broader than that. It's about roads. It's about making sure that there's broadband 3 miles out of Toronto. It's about all of these things, just providing a context for people to keep innovating, to create those jobs, and for businesses to invest in those communities and to deliver. And really, I think one of the big issues here is like Farah was saying, we can't have piecemeal reform. We need to make sure that when we do things right, and we don't do things halfway. Because when things are halfway, then businesses don't commit. And really, we need commitment from all parts in order to keep jobs fixed and stable.
And could I just add very briefly to something Miguel just said then? Would that be okay?
Yes.
I just think Miguel's point about full employment is just really crucial. And, you know, what it makes me think about is for a lot of economies around the world, you know, we need to think about even your Build Back Better challenge at the beginning of this conversation, but more broadly, you know, where is the growth going to come from and where is the employment going to come from? It's really important that, you know, there are some things that we don't want to go back to after the crisis, which defined our economies before the crisis. But that doesn't mean that each of our economies didn't have, you know, strengths that we shouldn't abandon as we try and create some of these new jobs. In my own case in Australia, and I suspect in Canada, it's probably similar. We have strengths in agriculture, we have strengths in resources, we have these sorts of strengths where innovation is important within those industries, but not innovating away from those industries. And where a lot of the additional jobs will come from, they'll come from clean energy, but they'll come from the services sector, as Miguel rightly identifies. They will come from the care economy. And even when we think about place-based programs and local labour market programs, we should be thinking more broadly than we've traditionally seen that, which is, yes, there's a role for kind of public works and infrastructure and all of those important local projects, but also for, you know, work traditionally done by charities, also, you know, care economy roles, all of these sorts of roles, environmental restoration projects, all of these sorts of things, we should be thinking about as additional to some of our traditional strengths rather than doing as our opponents like to pretend, which is that we will wipe the slate clean with areas that our nations have done well out of and replace it with something else. We're talking about additionality, and that's how we get on the path to full employment.
You know, that's an interesting point because the framing of this crisis and what we want to see out of it becomes politically important, right? And how do progressives frame the situation in which we find ourselves and what we need to do to improve our societies going forward? And we see some of the framing, particularly in the United States, but in Canada and elsewhere, around what one would call the populist right, if you like. And how do we make sure that we, when I say we, the progressive left, let me call it that for lack of a better expression, how do we make sure we're framing what we want to see going forward in a way that resonates with our populations? And we don't lose that battle, because we've lost that battle over and over again, historically, in different situations. So I think, Jim, you were touching upon that in terms of the fact that it's too easy for people to say, well, you know, your ideas are fine, but you want to throw out all the good, right? You hear that from President Trump, you hear it wherever. How do we make sure we don't lose the framing battle, if I can call it that? Miguel?
Well, I think that one of the major challenges when we start questioning this populist narrative is that we ourselves become sort of, as opposed to populists, we don't want to change anything. We are defending the establishment in the system. And people are yearning for change. Mm-hmm. And so I think we need to decide not what is our kind of populism. And some people defend this sort of left populist idea, but really what is the kind of real and radical and bold and effective change we want to do. And really, what is the difference between being a left populist and being a left change maker? And really, I think the issue we need to take issue with is that some of these people who are populists, they simplify all the problems. They come with a number of uncertainties. They are not pluralists. And indeed, very often, when we're not populists, when we were technocrats, maybe 15, 20 years ago, with some of the previous political projects of the progressive area, we were also not very pluralist ourselves. We were saying, this is what the market says, this is what science says, this is correct. Just like the 2008 crisis puts the credibility and the authority and the legitimacy of the market into question. Really, I think this pandemic has made all citizens look for politicians who accept uncertainty, who accept they don't know everything, who accept that we need to discuss things and they are not the owners of what is right and what is wrong. And so I think if we adopt this humble, progressive approach towards building with people and look to building in a participative way, I think we will be able to turn some of the levers and convince people that, no, this is not progressive hubris. No, this is not far-right populism. This is not politically correctness either. This is actually people who want to build change, which is meaningful, but want to build it with you. And I think this will charm people.
Mm-hmm. And can I add to that? I think you've just really hit it on the nail there, Miguel, because I think part of it is, we've been living in a time of politics of division versus inclusion, right? So part of the challenge is if you don't bring these people together to be part of the solution, everyone thinks they're left out. And that's what you've sort of seen. And that kind of disengagement from the system leads to things like populism. It leads to people sort of saying the government doesn't work for me, and leads to certain types of governments being voted in because it's all about the individual versus the collective. And so I think what we need to do is sort of recognize that if you think you have all the solutions, first of all, you don't. No good government actually thinks they have all the solutions. And that's what we've sort of seen in this is, I think, a bit more of a reaching out to different stakeholders, working across party lines, understanding that it's not going to be one versus the other. In one of the videos, we were talking about big business versus small business and where the emphasis should be. I don't actually see it that way. I don't see it as one versus the other. I really see it as you have to stop the division part, and you have to stop putting people in their different buckets. The buckets have changed so dramatically that we don't, one of the ways we move forward is to forget about the old stuff and understand that we're living in such different times. We've leveled the playing field in so many different ways, in some ways, and in others, they become more entrenched. And the last thing I'll say is I go back to, we were having a discussion of youth and this idea of full employment. Full employment for sure, and I think that's very aspirational, and I think that's really, really important. But more important, I think, is fully engaged in your community. So you may not be employed in your community, but you have to have some sort of connection, or you see what we saw when we were seeing sort of the uprisings in the Middle East, where youth didn't have anything to do, right? And so when you feel lost, you pull back from that which should be pulling you in. So I think there are a bunch of different layers in terms of how do you get rid of this populist idea. You have to really stop the division conversation of this is good for this person or this is good. I come back to the issue of shared prosperity. How do you make sure that every single person sees that the change is a good thing for them, or it's a good thing for their community, and appeal to that kind of behavior? And then finally, I think we're in such a different place in terms of this idea of vulnerability. I don't care who you talk to. You could be really, 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 I mean, it's different but everyone's been affected. So you could be really, really, really wealthy, or you could be very, very, very poor. And everybody has been affected. Nobody can say they have not been affected in some way through this crisis. It's impossible. Find me one person who can say that. It's not possible.
No, I think that's right.
Right.
Yeah. It's interesting when you look at the four pitches, there are obviously different starting points, different challenges, but what they all reflect is a mix of tools that they are putting forward or asking for, in a sense, to deal with whatever particular challenge they are focused on. in this country, Canada, but I think in other countries as well, fair bit of discussion around what we call a guaranteed annual income, but others around the world call UBI, Universal Basic Income. You see Nils Gilman talking about universal basic capital or credit, which I have to confess I didn't know a lot about until I watched his video, and then I started to do a little research. In this country, there is, I would say, some momentum towards a universal basic income. You see Matthew Mendelsohn, however, saying, don't go there. Don't create a big new program where actually the political buy-in may be very hard to get. We don't have the evidence yet to figure out what works and what doesn't in relation to how you'd structure a universal basic income. Let's work with the programs we have, like our child care benefit, like our healthcare system, and let's identify the gaps and fix those. Where do you come from? In a way, I'm beginning to think something like a UBI, or what we call guaranteed annual income, is almost too easy. It's not, and I'm not suggesting easy to implement, and the cost we may not be able to afford, but in a way it's a default. Oh, okay, that sounds good, and maybe that deals with some problems. Let's just go there and say, look, shiny new thing in the window, and let's close the books. I am exaggerating, but there, we've got this shiny new program, and let's just move on. Where do all three of you come from on that? I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe a guaranteed annual income is part of the toolbox going forward. But as I say, I'm beginning to think maybe it's intellectually lazy, and maybe it doesn't solve a lot of our structural problems. Miguel.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, I mean, I think, first of all, UBC, Universal Basic Capital, or Universal Basic Credit, as Nils was talking about, is different. It's tackling a different problem, because we really do have endowment inequality or wealth inequality. And we do need to give people a bit of a leg up in society in order to have that endowment, be it help them buy a house or have some sort of easy way to save, or be it baby bonds. I find those ideas quite interesting and insightful. Completely different is the universal basic income story, because I think when you might give people this floor, but actually, given that there's an unequal distribution of job opportunities, you're going to have pockets of society which are not working. As a result, they are not fully integrated, as Farah was saying, into society. And this is just going to generate more division, because the politics of who deserves to get what is going to get boiled up again. So I'm actually in agreement with Professor Mendelsohn's ideas. And I think we also can't do UBI for another reason. And we can't invent big programs for another reason, which is buy-in. We need to use these existing simple policies which we have, because if you start inventing thousands of new different transfer programs, people just won't join them. And so I think it's absolutely right to go with the traditional tools we have, cash transfers in these public services. And I think it's very interesting how Professor Mendelsohn put it about non-monetary income. When you provide childcare to a family, you are saving them hundreds of euros or dollars or whatever your currency is in childcare costs. Same with public transport. And so I do think that's really quite an important tool. And his third point was better work. And just to wrap up with this, because Farah was talking about being fully integrated in the community, I think you can't be fully integrated into the community if you have the kinds of precarious work that is currently existing. And then also if you have the kind of working time that currently exists as well. Some people are working 12 hours a day. There is no way for you to be able to engage in civil society, to raise a family, to keep studying if you are working all these hours. We need to begin to contain working times again. And this will also generate more jobs, because if you have all these hours to work, if you split up through less working time for each person, more people will be employed. That might be a solution for shared prosperity getting out of this crisis.
Jim, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm not a UBI enthusiast, but I certainly understand why people are attracted to the idea. I think that the key here is still targeted social security. I think the key here is still, a safety net of sorts, but that it needs to be set at a rate where people have a genuine shot at not just supporting themselves, but in a way that they can, look for work or engage in society in other ways. And I think the idea of, some of the other benefits that we as, decent governments and economies and societies should provide. We call it the social wage in Australia, universal healthcare, free education, all the rest of it. Those are crucial aspects of it too. My fear is that if you get into too much of the U part of UBI, then our capacity to pay for something meaningful for the people who need it most is fairly substantially compromised. On the UBC concept, I must concede, a bit like you, and it piqued my interest, but it hasn't been a long-standing interest. I'm not an expert on it, but again, here we have a system of compulsory superannuation or compulsory retirement saving, which turns people into owners of, in lots of cases, substantial capital, but not in the kinds of ways that was explained in the idea pitch. So it's something, obviously, that I think a lot of us will look more into.
It's getting close to time to go to some questions, but before we do, I was struck also by the fact that I think implicitly or explicitly in all four pitches, there is reference to the fact that we actually don't have the right data in many cases to make the right public policy decisions. I guess, why is that? We live in this world of digitization and automation and big data and AI and algorithms, all of which should be making us better. All of which I realize there are challenges with algorithms and AI and all of that. But in theory, it is all supposed to be making us better informed, more efficient, being able to make better both personal decisions, but also governments being able to make better public policy decisions. Somehow, so far, it does not seem that that is the case. And speaking here at home in Canada, I think we have identified during COVID huge information gaps. For example, we were not collecting data in terms of the potential disproportionate impact of COVID and even basic healthcare services on our racial minorities in cities like Toronto. How is that possible at this point in the 21st century when we're all supposed to have instant access to good information and AI to analyze that data in new and exciting ways? So it seems to me that without getting that part right, we're apt to make the mistakes of the past, just repeat the mistakes of the past. So how do we fix that?
So, Anne, I'm going to jump in here for a second. So as part of my responsibility at the Board of Trade, we are building an economic blueprint institute. And you've really nailed it. Like there are a couple of issues around data. First of all, people have to participate in giving up their information. And people don't, like we had a battle here, I guess it was in our last, I think 4 years ago, about whether or not we should have a regular census. I mean, that's ridiculous. Just even that conversation is crazy. Of course you should have a regular census. How are you going to know who's living in your country? So you have to start from the basic premise of, will people give you their data? And there's this whole issue around privacy, and that's holding people back from giving of their information for us to make good decisions. At the Economic Blueprint Institute, we started to collect data on things like transportation, affordable housing. And when you start to connect those dots, so are people able to live close to where they work? Because we have a lot of people who are working outside and they have to come inside. So they've got transportation issues. In a time of COVID, when people don't want to be on public transportation, that kind of data makes really good sense for when you're trying to build back better. Back to your original question. If you don't know where people are living, how long it takes them to get to work, whether or not they can afford to live close to work or they're living in 2 hours out, you can't make good decisions. And part of the challenge here is we don't collect data at that kind of granular level. So it's not just collection of data, it's how you're actually collecting that data and from whom and what period of time. Some of our Stats Canadian data Stats Canada data is actually really dated. It's 4 years old, and we can't make decisions for now even versus, forget about 10 years from now on old data. So how do we fix it? I think we have to really get at this idea of privacy and how is information held that holds people back. I think we really have to start connecting the dots on the data that we have. So you're not just looking at transportation over here and you're not connecting the dot to housing, or you're not connecting the dots to a whole bunch of other issues. That I think is the key, is remove what holds people back from giving data and this issue that my privacy will be compromised. And then how you're actually using that data once you have it is the connectivity between those issues. I think that's a huge, huge fail.
Miguel or Jim, views on that?
Sure.
You're both elected officials. Obviously, data is going to be important to anything you do. Miguel, your party's in government. Jim, you're in opposition, wishing to be the government soon. So, how are you going to make your decisions if you're not collecting the right data and analyzing it in a timely way?
Well, first of all, I think we need to take into account that government already has a huge amount of data itself. And most of the time it's not using the data that it has. Just to give you an example, in 2016, we implemented automatically giving people the social electricity tariff, which is a discounted electricity tariff in case you are from a low-income family. And suddenly we had an increase from 70,000 families making use of this tariff to 700,000. It multiplied by 10. So there were all these people who were not accessing this discount, this social benefit, just because they weren't going to ask for it, but because the government used its data, it managed to reach people in need much better. But really, I think the big question about data is that the way in which we are structuring data isn't helping us to get to the right conclusion. And Farah was touching on that on a number of ways, and I completely agree with all that she said. But I think touching on some of the issues that we saw in the pictures, I mean, there are three big examples of how we can use data to shift the public narrative and help us make meaningful change in a sense of shared prosperity. Piketty and Syed, they came up with this idea of distributional GDP. And one of the statistics they came up with was during the past few years, there's been no growth at all for most of the lower class, very little growth for the middle class, and huge growth for the upper class, in the top 1%. If we don't take into account how growth is distributed, we won't see if this recovery is affecting everybody. Another issue is what Heather said about well-being GDP. We've discussed this as well previously already, and how sort of, a number of areas beyond the money in your pocket matters and access to a number of rights. But one of the last things which I want to talk about is, and touch on it with data, is public finance. Because I think there's a big risk that we go back to austerity, and that people begin saying we need to have sound money, we need to reduce costs. And one of the big mistakes which we made in Europe for the past 10 years is that when we are looking at budget deficits, we are not taking into account the spending on social services, on the national healthcare service, and we are not taking into account how much we're spending to service the debt, on interest payments. And so people were saying loads of bad stuff about Italy, for example, but Italy has had a primary surplus for all these years. And so if we don't count interest payments, they have been doing good work in terms of fiscal responsibility. But people were saying they were fiscally irresponsible. And so I think as we go to recover, we need to make sure that we are not counting as a negative in our fiscal indicators, all spending on good stuff, all spending on public investment, on the care economy, on the national healthcare service to make sure that it responds to the pandemic. I think these kind of spending should be excluded from the deficit calculation so that we don't begin a discussion on austerity that cuts into these essential areas. And that's using data to make good decisions.
That's an interesting proposition you've put forward, that you would exclude that. You would exclude those expenditures which are actually, for most governments, the biggest expenditures they have, right?
Yeah.
Jim, thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Anne. I think just to pick up where Miguel left off, I think one of the big challenges really is the inability of budgets in around the world to capture, the full benefits of social and other kinds of investment. I think that's a really good point. But in terms of data more broadly, this is the game changer in public policy and in service delivery. And I think, as Farah mentioned a moment ago, it is unfortunately the conversation around it is dominated by the downside. It's dominated by suspicion. It's dominated by privacy concerns, and some of those are obviously legitimate. And in some countries, including mine, it's dominated by this sense that the government only really wants data to do things like chase after people who are being overpaid in the social security system, or some other kind of punitive purpose. But the reason it's the game changer is because if you just take early childhood, for example, I mean, how are we going to successfully intervene in the lives of disadvantaged communities when it comes to our young people, with all of the extraordinary payoffs, not just fiscal, but social, economic, cascading through generations? How are we going to do that if we can't recognize the patterns, recognize the concentrations? So I think it's just, absolutely crucial that we get much better at measuring what really matters, not instead of GDP, unemployment, wages growth, and the like, but in addition to. The New Zealanders have got a model there, which is worth looking at. Their wellbeing budget is a fascinating exercise. My friend Grant Robertson's done a hell of a lot of great work there, the finance minister, in making that something which is very important to the way they make decisions there. We all should be contemplating steps like that. We should be thinking about what in the data tells us about the big barriers to social mobility in particular, because unless we understand those, and we've got remarkable opportunities to better understand them, we won't be able to eliminate them.
Good point. Okay, here are a couple of questions from the audience. And this one's kind of interesting, actually. What are the key skills in public servants that you would like to see so that the trap of short-term thinking and aiming for low-hanging fruit isn't the goal or becomes the reality? Interesting question, right? In terms of, well, a very interesting question in terms of who actually drives real change in our governments. Elected officials, public servants, professional, nonpartisan public servants, whatever. But this person is asking, what are the key skills? And I mean, we've all talked about in our respective governments and levels of government, the renewal of our public service. Have our public services become risk averse to such a degree in the names of transparency and accountability, which are good values too, that public servants actually, we've stripped out not their ability, but we haven't given them the framework in which to be risk takers, as long as they have the right information, but risk takers in terms of offering innovative solutions to elected officials and, quite honestly, to the larger society. What do you think? Any views on that? What are the key skills you'd like to see in the public servants who actually, day in, day out, elected officials come and go, as we all know. Public servants tend to make a career of it.
I think the key there, Anne, if you wouldn't mind me kicking off, is really people who have the capacity to contribute to an evaluation culture. I think there's a problem in so many of the democracies of the world where the announcement of a policy is seen as the kind of endpoint. There's a policy development process which ends with a senior elected official announcing a policy, and it's in the media for a day or two. But where we fall down, I think, is the kind of evaluation process after that, measuring what works, the capacity to understand and deliver, long-term gains. I think that's really when we think about institutional decay and we think about the way that capacity has been eroded by a lot of the ways that that public services spend a lot of money on contractors and consultants now. We lost that capacity to think about a policy beyond the announcement. I think that's one of the really noticeable things, because and some countries have evaluator generals, or they have evaluation units in their bureaucracies. I think that's a really good development that we all should be looking at, because absent that, then it is, nobody ever really knows whether a policy that you could have spent 5 minutes developing it or 5 years developing it. Nobody knows if it works unless we measure it, keep an eye on it, evaluate it, tweak it, and think about the long-term consequences.
And maybe I'll just jump in here with it. It's not that I mean, it's a great question, but I also think that the question that we really need to look at is, when I think about characteristics of public servants, are they making decisions for the people that they're like? Are they able to relate to the people that they are making the decisions for? Mm-hmm. So one thing we have not talked about in the inclusivity conversation is immigrants and refugees. They've been left out of this entire conversation, right? Not mentioned. I don't think they were mentioned in the videos. Yet for Canada, for example, for us to grow, we're going to need a significant number of immigrants. And we're also a very open population with respect to refugees. Whether or not we build what they need or we give them what they need to succeed is an entirely different conversation. But in this conversation, public servants, are we recruiting? Are we keeping the type of public servants that we need to have to make decisions for the populations they're making the decisions for? Do we have young people in the public service? Do we have newcomers or immigrants, refugees in the public service? So who's making the decisions? Who gets into the public service would be my question. Because I think we have a lot of great public servants who are smart, they're analytical, they want to take risks. There are some barriers that prevent them from doing that. But your public service has to reflect, like we say about politicians, right? Why do we put the division in there? So I think there's a real challenge around, do we have public servants that reflect the people they're making decisions for? And I would argue that we don't. Mm-hmm. Tell me who's going to make up our youth policy. Yeah. I don't know that we're engaging youth, and having a youth council is great, but is it enough? Are they ingrained enough in the system to make the change? And I would argue they're not. So it's not necessarily about characteristics. It's about the composition of our public service.
Miguel, any thoughts?
Yes, I completely agree with both of these points, both the priority to relate, which I think diversity is important. Also because I think this diversity introduces a certain competitiveness to being in public service, which means that people strive to excel rather than just being, if everybody's the same, just like you can just sort of sit back and let things happen. I think complementing on this, I think we also need to talk about how, in order to relate, public service needs to be a lot more about talking straight and communicating in a simple and effective way to people. Also, in terms of the evaluation system, which Jim was talking about, I absolutely agree. Really, after announcements, most policies aren't followed up on. In academia, we talk a lot about sort of saying, does this policy increase GDP or income X percent? More than that kind of result, I think a lot of the time we don't even consider the outputs. We don't even say how many people were actually trained by this professional training program, how many students were actually put through this childcare system. Because if we do look at these outputs, then most of the time we'll see that our policies are not working as well as they should be. And so I think fixing the accountability system is absolutely essential, because that's the only way that we can shift the media economy from the announcement moment to also taking into account the final effect. And just to add a third element, and to wrap up here for public service traits, planning, being prepared, I think is something which we undervalue these days. And really, doing the work to know what you're talking about, I think is key. Not just for public servants, but also for politicians who are in a certain way in public service as well.
One would hope, Miguel, that politicians are at their very core motivated by public service, as opposed to power-hungry self-aggrandizement. But hey, maybe I'm naive. I have another question here from the audience, and it's about global level collaboration. What global level collaboration is needed? The G20 is conspicuous in its absence. What would greater coordination look like? And I think this is an interesting question. Farah commented on the level of collaboration we have seen domestically here in Canada, right? And I hope that in Portugal, Australia, and other countries domestically, levels of government have been working together to deal with the crisis. But I think it is fair to say that unlike the global financial crisis in 08, 09, where the world, especially the G20, came together with a coordinated response, we don't see that here. We see the European Union working, obviously, on a recovery project. You see a lack of global leadership from multilateral institutions like the G20, the G7, even the UN to some extent. And the United States seems to be missing in action. And whether we like it or not, the United States generally has to play an important role in terms of motivating global action, either because of their huge resources, intellectual or human, financial, just their dominance in terms of shaping world events. Seems to be missing in action. So the question is about, or the question makes the point that this person believes that level of global cooperation is missing. And how does that help us create a world, if we had that, how does that help create a world where we have shared prosperity? Anybody want to take a kick at that?
I'm happy to, Anne, if you'd like.
Okay.
Look, I think that is, you know, among the most conspicuous developments of this crisis is the almost total lack of involvement by the big multilateral institutions that we relied on during the GFC. Many of us were working in various capacities during that period and saw the remarkable work done by the G20 in particular, I think, during the global financial crisis has been more or less absent this time around. And I think you're spot on. I don't think it's just the Americans. I think the two biggest players have been, you know, not in the cart for making those problem-solving institutions a key part of dealing with the crisis. And so in their absence and with that void, I think there have been some promising developments in terms of cooperation between some of the middle powers and the middle-sized democracies and economies. It's not as conspicuous as a big G20 meeting in Scotland or something like that, or in Washington, DC, like we saw a little over a decade ago, but it is happening. We could think of it as the kind of coalition of the sensible in lots of ways. And there will be cooperation. I think where that's going to really matter is because in lots of the developing world, this virus is only really just gathering steam. And so for a lot of developed countries, including some of those middle-sized democracies and economies who, you know, may be among the earliest to get a handle on the outbreak, I think a lot of those developing world countries will be relying heavily on us for some of that cooperation, because, I mean, we have our own problems in the developed economies of the world, but they are nothing compared to what we might anticipate in the developing world, and that's where cooperation is going to be incredibly crucial.
Farah, you've worked.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, right? Because it's such a global problem, and the absence of, you know, global cooperation. I'm not sure that I believe that there's not. I mean, we haven't seen it because no one's traveling. You don't see a big, you know. Think about when we think about leaders getting together. They're all sitting around the table. There's conversations. There's lots of media attention. And so we haven't seen it. I'm not sure I agree that there hasn't been the level that we'd like to see, because people have had to have their heads down and dealing with their own domestic problems. But I'm not sure that I agree there hasn't been. Has it been as acute or as focused as we would have had because we had a financial crisis and everyone understood what that looked like? I think a lot of it is the unknown, right? So in Africa, in some cases, some of those communities, because they had to deal with things like the spread of AIDS or polio or something like that, they have very robust healthcare systems on the ground. They know how to do things public health wise in their communities. We could actually learn from them. So while I understand, Jim, and I completely agree that we're going to have to share what we know, we're also going to have to pay attention to what they're doing as well and learn from them. Again, I think part of it is we haven't seen the global cooperation, and I'm not challenging. I don't think we've had the global cooperation we'd want to see. And yeah, I am going to squarely blame actors like the US. Quite the opposite is what they've been doing, right? Is they, because of the leadership they have there, they've been sort of circling themselves. And I think that is problematic. If you have leaders who are going to do that at that level, it's going to be very, very hard for people to think that their collaboration at the global level will make an impact. And I think that's part of the issue is, are we set up for success in that regard? No, I don't think so. But are organizations like the WHO sharing information between governments? Yes. We haven't seen the OECD, we haven't seen the World Bank, we haven't seen the G7, we haven't seen the G20, but are those the actors that really we need to have at the table? Or is it the WHO who should be sharing that information across? I know during SARS, Anne,
Yes.
if we hadn't had the warning signs from the WHO, again, it's timing and it's information sharing. And that stuff happens without leaders sitting around a table.
True.
Sometimes it's more effective. I hate to say it, but sometimes it's faster and more effective. I'm not making any fans there, I'm sure, but
Miguel, any thoughts?
I think that we're absolutely correct in placing this this discussion on global cooperation, because we can't have shared prosperity only within our bubble of Western advanced economies, and we need to look at shared prosperity in a wider sense. I think there's a big question of how, with the reorganization of the world economy, with the shortening of global value chain, how will emerging and developing economies resist, and how will the livelihoods of those people face, how will they be in the future? But also, I think even when we're discussing the challenges of our own Western advanced economies, we also need to look at the issues ourselves and cooperate ourselves. I mean, in Europe, we've managed to make this groundbreaking efforts, and now the European Union is going to issue debt for the first time ever. I mean, we need to overcome often, in terms of global cooperation, issues of trust. And I think we can't build trust unless we talk to each other. I mean, part of this recovery summit's importance is also that it puts progressive people in touch with each other and talking. And so I think these networks of policymakers, of people in politics, of people in academia talking to each other, figuring out solutions, figuring out why they don't trust the other one to implement those other kinds of solutions, can really help to build solutions and to implement them on a global scale, but also on a national scale as well. And that's another form of cooperation. Yeah.
Right. I think very thoughtful responses on that question from all three of you. Now, I am getting word from the puppet masters behind the scenes that it is time to wrap up. But before we go there, what I would like from each of you is a final comment in terms of either, I think, likelihood of success, either in your own countries or globally, in terms of transformative change, shared prosperity, a barrier you see to that, anything that you've taken both from the pitches and from our conversation this morning with which you'd like to conclude. And let us hope, but it doesn't have to be on a positive note. Okay, who shall I start with? Jim, why don't I start with you?
Well, thanks very much again, Anne and Farrar and Miguel for the opportunity to have a chat with you. I found it, a terrific opportunity. Look, I think there is cause for optimism where we already govern, to not miss this opportunity which is before us. To build back better, as you said, to deal with labour market scarring, to try and prevent that lost generation that we were speaking about a moment ago. I think for those of us, in opposition around the world, the politics are difficult in the near term as people kind of rally around governments, and we all want
Mhm.
governments to succeed because that means more people surviving the virus and fewer people losing their jobs. But so I think the politics are unclear. I'm not sure if I'd be optimistic or pessimistic on that front yet, but certainly where we already hold the reins of power, I think that there is lots of cause for us to be confident that we can learn the lessons, that we can do better than go back to how our economies were before.
Thank you, Jim. Farah.
Yeah, I mean, in the interest of just making sure the puppet masters don't cut us off and move on to the next thing, I guess I would say I'm optimistic because I don't have any other way about me. But that optimism really belongs, I think, in three different sort of places. I want us to be aspirational, and I think we are in the place where we can be. I want us to be practical because we have to be, and that gives me optimism because I do think that there are people who are seeing practical solutions and have the willingness to rinse and repeat where it makes sense. And then I think we will be very successful if we can build in this idea of accountability. And accountable, and I'll come back to exactly where we started, which is accountable to whom? Accountable to everyone, so that we don't leave people out. And that, you know my background, Anne, but I would define myself as a champion of women first, obviously, of young people, and then perhaps because I was a refugee to this country, looking at newcomers. And I really believe this is a chance for us to level set in some ways that we've never been inspired to do so, because we've never seen this level of difference between. It's just never been felt like it's been felt now. So I'm optimistic. I kind of have to be able to do the work that I want to do in the world as well.
Right. Miguel.
Yeah, I completely agree that we can be optimistic. I mean, there's that famous quote about the optimism of the will and the pessimism of the intellect. So I think we must be optimistic with our wills. I mean, the sheer scale of this crisis, the fact that we have a crisis as well of the climate and of our democratic system, I mean, the change is absolutely necessary. Of course, if you think about it, it's very hard to implement change. CAPS was extremely mobile, and we're going to need to require it to make some sacrifices as well. There's a big focus on short-termism as well. But if we unite as progressives, if we keep focused and we keep principles, then I believe that we can marshal together the policy instruments and the energy to push through meaningful change and enact shared prosperity. Once again, thank you so much for a wonderful morning of discussion.
That was great, guys, because you do leave me with renewed optimism for the fact that there may very well be important transformational change, whether we call it Build Back Better or whatever else, to ensure that so many people who have been disproportionately negatively impacted, both before COVID but coming out of COVID, quite honestly, have a chance, have a chance at a better life wherever they live, regardless of from wherever they started. So with that, I want to thank all of you. It was great. Farah, I've known a long time. Miguel and Jim, wonderful to get to meet you. Good luck to all three of you in terms of the important work you are doing. I know all three of you to actually help bring about inclusive shared prosperity. Now, we are going to take a break before our next session. Stay tuned for the Inclusive Societies theme, co-chaired by Mayor Sadiq Khan. That will begin at 11:20 a.m. Eastern. I look forward to seeing you all then. Again, thank you, all three of you, so much. That was a wonderful discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anne.
It was lovely to meet you.
Bye.
Hi, well, good morning from Montreal. I realize it is not Montreal or not morning for all of you, but welcome back to day 2 of the Recovery Summit. My name is Anna Gainey. I am the past president of the Liberal Party of Canada and also currently the executive director of the Gainey Foundation. Thank you all for being here, for joining this summit. And I hope, like myself, you enjoyed the panel this morning on shared prosperity. I thought it was a thought-provoking start to the day and a nice springboard into the topic that we're going to be looking at now, which is inclusive societies. And the focus is on the importance of strengthening our social fabric. Yesterday, we set the table a little bit with the global perspective of the challenges this pandemic has created both to our global economic systems and structures and obviously to global health. And as we drill down a little bit today and we look at the impact on societies, I think it's fair to say that the impact of the pandemic has at a minimum exposed, if not really exacerbated in some cases, the fault lines in our societies. And we have an opportunity, I think, to come out of the pandemic, to rebuild better, by tackling these fault lines, be it social injustice or inequality and other such issues that we feel within our societies. And I'm looking forward to this panel today that will discuss some of the ideas and opportunities and challenges that we face as progressives as we look to build back better and build inclusive societies. So it's a pleasure to have with us today Lori Lightfoot, the Mayor of Chicago, Minouche Shafik, the Director of the London School of Economics, Zubaydah Haq, the Interim Director of the Runnymede Foundation, the Runnymede Trust, excuse me, and of course, Mayor Sadiq Khan with us from London, who is also our co-chair for this segment of the summit. Mayor Khan was elected in May of 2016, and recently in response to the impact of the pandemic on London's businesses, as well as the more acute impact on London's Black, Asian, and other minority communities. He is now leading efforts to rebuild the city and ensure that it is reimagined as a city that is a place for everyone to enjoy a greener, fairer, and more resilient community, perhaps even stronger than it was before. So we look forward to hearing more about your plans and your efforts there in London, Mayor Khan. And with that, I thank you for joining us, and I will turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Anna. I know we've been joined by people from around the world whose cities and countries are at different stages in the struggle against coronavirus. So I want to start by saying my thoughts are with you at this difficult time, all of you. And as always, London stands with you, willing to help in any way that we can. This pandemic is inflicting a heavy toll, creating far-reaching social and economic consequences. This is no ordinary crisis, but a once-in-a-generation upheaval. And like with other pivotal moments in our history, how we choose to respond will define our societies for decades to come. I've lived through major recessions before. In particular, I remember the dreadful damage caused by the recession in the UK in the early 1980s. It occurred when I was growing up in public housing in London, and it had a major impact on my community and the whole country. I remember the turmoil inflicted by long-term unemployment, the way the poorest and those from ethnic minority backgrounds were often the worst affected, and how existing inequalities deepened due to government inaction at the time, which led to people being denied opportunities to reach their full potential. As we plan the road to recovery from this recession now, what's right at the forefront of my mind is how we must do everything possible to avoid a return to mass unemployment and the negative ripples that always flow years later. How we must actively work towards building fairer, more inclusive societies where no one is left behind, and vitally, how we can prevent a backward slide in our long battle against gender, racial, and wealth inequality. It's absolutely vital that we get this right, because the COVID-19 crisis is not only exposing many old inequalities, but massively exacerbating them too. We've seen how those on the lowest incomes and from ethnic minority communities are being disproportionately hit, both in terms of health and economic consequences of this pandemic. And we've seen how women are more likely to have had their careers disrupted than men in recent months, because they're bearing the brunt of additional childcare and homeschooling responsibilities. You know, the IMF has gone as far as to warn that if left unchecked, 30 years of gains for women's economic opportunities could be erased. We simply can't allow this to happen. In my city, as you've heard, we've established something called the London Recovery Board. This is about bringing people together from all parts of our society, including both the public and private sector, to collectively agree on the action we must take to ensure Londoners are not held back, but instead are supported to thrive in the months and years ahead. I look forward to sharing more details about the plans during the course of this discussion and listening to what other cities are doing around the world. Let me end with this before we begin the discussion. Ultimately, I believe we all have a duty to help create economic recoveries that work for everyone, where neither opportunity nor achievement is limited by gender, race, sexuality, disability, or background. It was Gordon Brown, the former British Chancellor and Prime Minister, who said, "The good economy and the good society advance together." And now more than ever, we need to dispel the myth that the goals of economic recovery, protecting jobs, supporting businesses, and reducing inequality are somehow in conflict. The truth is, they go hand in hand, which is something we must demonstrate now once again as we seek to create the inclusive, fair, and equal societies that our citizens deserve. Thank you.
Right. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. And thank you very much to Mayor Khan, Anna Gainey, and to the Recovery Project for organising this incredibly important discussion. Now, I'm delighted today to have with me Mayor Khan, Mayor Laurie Lightfoot, and Baroness Minouche Shafiq, who's the director of LSE. We're going to be talking about COVID recovery in the context of inequalities, not just about productivity, not just about GDP, but in the context of inequalities. Now, the one thing we know about this pandemic is that it's not just a health crisis, it's also a social and economic crisis, as Mayor Khan has told us about. So I'd like to start, first of all, with a couple of questions to both the mayors about what they're doing in their cities. We know, for instance, that while there's been a crumb of comfort that we've all been in this pandemic together, at the same time, we know that we're not in the same boat. We're weathering the same storm, but we're not in the same boat. So I'd be really interested today to hear from all of our panel members, but to begin with from Mayor Khan and Mayor Lightfoot about what they're doing in particular in their cities, London and Chicago. Mayor Khan, would you mind if I started with you to ask you, what is it that you're doing in London with an emphasis on inclusion and race equality?
Thanks, Zubaida. I mean, I think in Anna's introduction, she talked about, and I talked about in my comments, the pandemic not simply shining a spotlight on the inequalities in London and indeed in cities across the globe, but actually it's exacerbated some of those inequalities. And so what we've done in London is when it comes to both transition means as lockdown restrictions are eased. So in transition and recovery, how we have a new normal, that was alluded to before, how we involve in that decision-making people affected by the decisions we make. So I've made sure we include not just different tiers of government, local, regional, central, but also public and private, civic society, but in particular, Zubaida, frankly speaking, women, ethnic minorities, and others who have really suffered during this pandemic. I'll give you an illustration of the mistakes that are made when decisions are made by one group of people. So when it came to our government, the British government, easing restrictions, the fact that they allowed men's beards to be trimmed, but not women's eyebrows to be threaded, it may sound like a frivolous point, but it demonstrated who was making the decisions. I'll give you another one. They made available lots of tests for sportsmen to be tested, but no tests for teachers to be tested or they ask schools to return. So the key thing we've done, Zubaida, is make sure process involves key parts of London's community, leading to, I think, substantive decisions that are better, that deal with both the transition and recovery, but address some of the inequalities that I know Mayor Lightfoot feels strongly about, as indeed does Minosh as well.
And what about you, Mayor Lightfoot? I mean, we're very interested in what's going on in Chicago, because just as the inequalities were highlighted at the beginning of the pandemic in the UK, at the same time, we saw those stark inequalities being amplified in the States, and in particular in Chicago, where we saw a disproportionate number of Black people as well as Latinx people being hit very hard by this pandemic, and not being hit just health-wise, but also economic and social-wise. So could you elaborate a little bit about what you're doing in Chicago in terms of COVID recovery?
Well, I'll talk about it in a lot of different frames. Number one is, as you mentioned, we started to see very early on in the pandemic that there was a disproportionate impact on communities of color. We came out and announced early on that we were seeing Black Chicagoans die at 7 times the rate of every other demographic. And one of the things that we did right away is form what we've called a racial equity rapid response team. And we brought together community stakeholders, local healthcare providers, the trusted voices in the community, but to reach out, to educate, and then connect people up with services. We've seen great success in addressing the issue in Black Chicago, but we continue to be challenged in the Latinx community. So we widen the frame of our racial equity rapid response team to make sure that we also were addressing the challenges in our Latinx communities, which are geographically concentrated, which in some ways makes it easier, but some ways more complicated. The other things that we've done in general to make sure that we are responding to the economic needs of our residents is, right early on, we stood up a $100 million small business resiliency loan fund. That was filling voids that were created by the federal government's programs, and particularly making sure that the unbanked, meaning the smaller businesses that didn't have a long-standing relationship with their banks, got access to loans to help them support their payroll and the other economic challenges that they were facing. In addition to the unbanked, we also provided access to folks regardless of their citizenship status. So our federal government doesn't allow undocumented individuals to get access to government funding. So we filled that void here in Chicago. We stood up a $5 million micro business grant fund to make sure that we were pushing money into the hands of the very small businesses that employ 4 employees or less, to give them support in this difficult time. We stood up a $2 million housing fund assistance to provide our residents with supports on rent and mortgages. I will tell you though, the $2 million barely scratched the surface. And we were expecting to be able to provide supports for 2,000. We had 87,000 people apply. So the need is obviously great. And we've continued on since then with a lot of other additional supports. The one last thing that I'll say that I think is important for this conversation is, even though we were still in the throes of responding to COVID-19, we stood up a recovery task force. Sounds like along the lines of what Mayor Khan did in London. We looked at 10 different sectors of our city, not just our business, but also social services, community-based organizations, to look at the impacts and then to chart a course forward. And we were the first city in our country to stand up this kind of recovery task force and come out with a blueprint for how we move forward into the future.
Now that's incredibly interesting. And actually what's great is how both Mayor Khan and yourself, Mayor Lightfoot, illustrate how both of you are not just filling that gap where government in both the UK and the US hasn't stepped in. How importantly you yourselves as mayors are filling that gap, but how you're addressing the inequalities, the economic inequalities, the social inequalities, that investment, and bringing people together. Now, I'd like to move on to Dame Shafiq and just talk a little bit more about other players, if you like, in this field. We know you've highlighted very well how politicians, how government have stepped in to some extent and fill the economic gap. But Dame Shafiq, I was wondering if you could, sorry, you're a baroness now. Baroness Shafiq. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about institutions, because you're a director of one of the most famous universities in the world, the London School of Economics, Social Science University. So I was wondering, could you tell us a little bit more about the role that institutions can play and have played in this pandemic?
Yes, I think it's there are sort of three broad trends that this pandemic has caused, and I think every institution needs to reflect on what it means for them. Those trends, I think, are a trend toward localization, as supply chains are becoming much more local, as companies around the world are realizing the risk of highly integrated global supply chains and the vulnerabilities. I think the second big trend is digitization. We've all learned how much more we can do online, and we've seen that spread really quickly in sectors like finance and telecommunications, but it's now going much more into areas like retail, like education, like healthcare. And the third trend is socialization of risk. I think this crisis will result in many people demanding that more risks are shared more widely in society. We've seen who the most affected are, and some of the research we've done at the LSE, for example, had looked at which are the workers that have been hardest hit by the pandemic. And it's quite clear, it's the young, it's the Black and minority ethnic workers, it's the women, and it's the low skilled. They were the first to lose their jobs, they were the first to lose their wages. And there are the response to these three trends of localization, digitization, and the demand for socialization of risk can be done in an inclusive way. And I think every institution, whether it be an academic one or a business or a local government, can take a view on those trends, which is a more inclusive one.
Thank you very much, Baroness Shafiq, because I think you have raised some interesting issues around sort of the digitization of working, and how actually now you have a new way of working and working from home, and how that has raised challenges in terms of being able to switch off. That has certainly raised challenges for us in terms of work-life balance, our mental health, saying no at the end of the day, saying now it's time for my family, but how also in some ways it has raised opportunities for women, for instance, in terms of not being able to have to rush around for parents. But I want to talk a little bit more about women and also about ethnic minorities. I'm going to combine two broad areas, if you like, because the one thing we do know about this pandemic is that, as I said at the beginning, while we've all been weathering the same storm, we haven't been in the same boat, and that ethnic minorities and women have been socially, economically, and health-wise been hit disproportionately by this pandemic. Now, I wanted to start a little bit by talking about women, and I'll start with you, Baroness Shafiq, again. But I would like all of the panel members to answer this question. In terms of the hard-won gains that we've had with gender inequality, what do you think are some of the challenges that the pandemic has raised in terms of gender equality and in relation to women? And how do you think we can address this?
Yeah. Well, I think all the research on gender inequality and the gender pay gap, for example, show that the reason women earn less and are in jobs in which they tend to have advanced less in their career is because they do a disproportionate share of unpaid work. On average, in the world, women do about 2 hours more unpaid work than men. And in the advanced economies, we'd started to see that trend shifting, that men were doing more unpaid work and women were doing a little bit less. I mean, women were still doing more, varies a lot by country. But the pandemic has reversed that. And women are now finding themselves doing a disproportionate share of the caring roles, be it caring for children or the elderly. And that has severe consequences for their careers and loss forever. In fact, most women never recover from the income loss that they have from those periods in which they are doing higher levels of unpaid work. I think the answer to that question is to treat childcare as a part of the social infrastructure in a society, just like healthcare is. And to be able to equalize opportunities. And I don't say this only for equality reasons. I say this for productivity reasons. There's very clear evidence, for example, in the United States, that most of the productivity gains that occurred in the US from about the 1950s to about the 1980s and 90s, about 40% of those productivity gains was because you suddenly brought all the talent of women and Black people into the labor market. And the top jobs were no longer just dominated by white men. And suddenly you were able to use all the talent in society, and that resulted in matching people to the right jobs and higher productivity. So this isn't just politically correct equality speak, this is hard-nosed economics.
Yes. And I think that's absolutely right. It's a chance for us to look at the economy and think of the economy, as you rightly say, Baroness Shafiq, not just in terms of productivity, not just in terms of GDP, but as a caring economy. And ask the question about how the economy can be opposed to the other way around. Meg Khan, you talked quite a lot about your London Recovery Board, the London Transition Board. I was wondering, is gender equality, does it play a role in that board? How do you see the role, the issues around gender equality in the context of COVID-19 recovery?
I mean, it's huge. I mean, as Manoush was speaking, what she was saying was both profound and accurate. But that's why in my comments at the beginning, I referred to the IMF research, which shows that if we're not careful, 30 years of progress can be erased. Now, all of us on this call have always been frustrated about the lack of urgency. We've tried to work hard to get the equality agenda addressed quicker. Actually, for the first time in my lifetime, we're talking about going backwards. And it actually coincides with the culture war that Mayor Lightfoot will know more about than I do, but actually we're experiencing in the UK as well. But also the rise of nationalist, populist movements around the globe. And that's why Manoush has given us the economic data, why it's so important. Diversity leads to greater productivity, which leads to greater profit. That should be the last card we use, because there's a moral case and a social case why it's so important. So what we've done today is make sure that when it comes to the things I'm responsible for, we look at the impact on women and girls, on all our policies. I make sure, yes, I'm a man, but I surround myself with women in top positions, whether it's the deputy mayors, the business advisory board, whether it's other pieces of work we do, and a whole host of issues. The commissioner of the Met Police Service, I'm really proud, is now a woman for the first time in the history of the Met Police Service, and on and on. Because what Minouche was talking about is so important, because what will happen is, for politically expedient reasons, or some would argue economically expedient reasons, it will be reverting to the old norms. And that's why it's so important that we're vigilant. And that's why during the course of my comments, I was trying to explain the importance of us progressives around the globe understanding how we respond to this pandemic, this recession, is so important. And we've got to make the argument and be on the pitch to make the argument why it's so important. In my country, we're seeing it. Isabel, you're experiencing it with our government. Mayor Lightfoot's seeing it in her elections taking place in a few weeks' time. We're seeing it across Europe. And that's why we need a progressive global response with the evidence and data Minouche talked about, and I tried to introduce during my comments as well.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that's absolutely right. That's the only way that we're going to get women to be part of that mainstream. Mayor Lightfoot, do you think it's important to have women in the decision-making spectrum, in the decision-making room for COVID-19? Has it been an issue in Chicago and the States that women have not been an integral part of the decision-making around COVID-19?
No, women in my administration lead. Whether it's myself, whether it's our public health commissioner who's a female, many of the key decision makers and doers on our COVID-19 response are women, and particularly women of color. And you know, that's something that's just part of who I am and my DNA. But let me also say a couple of other things I think that address this moment. We have to be very intentional about how we respond to the economic challenges that we are facing. I can remember very vividly back in 2008 and 2009, when we faced a recession that is similar in scale, but obviously different in cause than what we're experiencing now. And I know at the time I was working in a large global law firm, and a decision was made just to cut to respond. But we weren't thoughtful about how we did that. And we certainly didn't think about diversity as important in that work. And what happened then when we came out on the other side is we cut into the meat of our diversity efforts. This is a very different economic downturn. And what we're seeing here is it is almost entirely driven by COVID-19 impacts. We will get beyond this. So on the one hand, we are absolutely facing dire economic circumstances, but we don't need to overcorrect because we know that this isn't an economic, large-scale structural readjustment. So I think that's one thing that's important. The other thing that I think that is critically important is as we think about how we react to this, and invariably, hard choices are going to have to be made, particularly at the city budget level. Our revenue streams have been dramatically impacted. But the one thing I've said to my team, and I will not do, is we will not abandon our values. And our values are rooted in equity and inclusion. If we just say that those are niceties that only can be embraced in easier times, we will lose the progress that has been made. And I think Mayor Khan is right to really sound the alarm on this issue. The other thing I want to say is this. In the United States, at least, while women have been invited into the workforce, we are being invited into structures that were created by and for the benefit of men. It still doesn't work. Women remain in the United States the primary caretakers of our children. That is a truism. And as we think about restructuring work environments, we've got to think about the realities of women's lives. And as we remain the primary caretakers of our children, we have to have structures and institutions that reflect that reality. And the last thing I'll say is, we launched a program here in Chicago that we're hoping to build up and scale up nationally. And it's called Your Home is Somebody's Workplace. And we have really uplifted the stories of the care workers. Again, predominantly women and predominantly women of color who are working in very difficult environments, not getting the kind of pay, not having portable benefits. And that, if we're going to get serious about making sure that this economy and the recovery is inclusive, we've got to think about the different places where our most vulnerable workers work and how we can improve the quality of their work lives.
Thank you very much, Mayor Lightfoot. I think that's absolutely right. And we should take this opportunity to look at the economy in terms of a gender equal economy. Now, one thing I'm conscious of is that we haven't talked very much about the aspect of race in the context of COVID-19. Now, we know from Chicago, we know from London, we know from the UK, from the US, that there have been a disproportionate number of deaths among Black and ethnic minority people in the context of COVID-19. We know from all the research that it's the pre-existing inequalities, racial inequalities, that have been amplified by COVID-19 to the extent that, if you like, the first people and the highest number of people who have lost their jobs, who have been the first to lose their jobs, have been predominantly from Black and ethnic minority backgrounds, as well as, of course, women. And we've got that intersectional inequality where it's BME women who are losing jobs quickly because theirs was the sectors from shutdown. Now, I want to talk a little bit about that and ask you all, and I'd like to start from Baroness Shafiq again, about how do we address the racial inequalities? Where can we start to address the racial inequalities that this pandemic has raised? And Baroness Shafiq, I'm just going to say, I hope you don't mind because I'm conscious of time, and as a chair, I've been naughty, I've gone over a little bit. If you could give me quick answers, starting with yourself, about how we can address the racial inequalities that have been amplified.
Well, the evidence I've seen is that there isn't a genetic reason why Black and ethnic minorities are more vulnerable to COVID. It's because of deprivation in general. The fact that they don't have access to healthcare, or maybe doing jobs that are more risky, et cetera, et cetera. And so it really goes to the issue of how do you address those conditions, those fundamental economic and social conditions. That is what's at stake. I think what we need in the wake of this crisis is a new social contract that addresses those fundamental issues. And that ranges from looking very seriously at precarious work and who is vulnerable. I think one of the things of this crisis is we all realized how dependent we are on workers who are on precarious and flexible contracts, many of whom didn't have benefits or sick leave. And so I think one of the most important things, particularly for Black and ethnic minority workers, is to address those underlying inequalities. Many cities have now said, if you're a flexible or gig worker or a self-employed person, you have to have access, you have to have a pension, and you have to have sick leave, and you have to have access to benefits. And employers can't pretend that you don't work for them and that you're not an employee. I think it's those kind of issues which address the fundamental conditions of people's lives, which will do the most to improve the lot of Black and ethnic minority workers.
Thank you, Baroness Shafiq. And actually, that's a good point to turn to, Mayor Lightfoot, to you, because Baroness Shafiq has highlighted the importance, the fundamental importance of having a welfare safety net for Black and ethnic minority people. Black and ethnic minority people in the UK are much more likely to be in poverty than their white counterparts. Do you see a safety net, as well as issues around housing, housing affordability and insecure jobs, also to be an issue or issues in Chicago in the US?
We see very similar issues, and that's why back in February, which seems like another lifetime ago, we announced a challenge for ourselves to eliminate intergenerational poverty in a generation. We held the first ever poverty summit in our city, and we laid bare a lot of the underlying causes. Little did we know that literally mere weeks later, we'd be really seeing some of these issues around poverty flashing like a neon sign as we saw the disproportionate impact on COVID-19. But look, the reality is, and I think the Baroness said it well, if you do not make these investments in communities of color, in communities that have been disenfranchised from investment for generations. You will just pay in a different way, in a more costly way. And Mayor Khan, I think, said this right. I believe that there's a moral imperative for us to do everything that we can to give people the real opportunity to really manifest their God-given talent. But there's an economic imperative as well. Neglect and poverty is not cost-free. And we need to make sure we understand that. Even in this time when we are suffering economically, we cannot abandon our values. We've got to make those investments. They are critically important to the future of our city and really our world to uplift people out of poverty.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mayor Lightfoot. I think that's absolutely right. Mayor Khan, I'm going to give you a slightly more controversial question because I think we should always end on a more exciting note, which is, do you think the UK government have done enough to address the racial inequalities that have not only been amplified by COVID-19, but have been exacerbated by COVID-19? And what would you, as Mayor of London, to do to address some of those racial inequalities? And I'm sorry, I'm conscious of time, so could you give me an answer, a succinct answer, if you like, in the next minute or so?
Okay. The British government has not done enough to address the inequalities that exist. Two big things have happened this summer. The brutal killing of George Floyd, which has led to this Black Lives Matter movement that has shone a spotlight on the racism, inequality, discrimination that Black people experience, not just in Minnesota and Minneapolis, not just in America, but around the globe. And it's really important that us progressives understand the importance of addressing that racism against Black people. The second issue is we now know that this pandemic has had a disproportionate impact on Black, Asian, minority ethnic people. I've asked the British Equalities and Human Rights Commission to embark on a statutory investigation into this disproportionality, and they've agreed to do one. Why is it that the first doctors who go and treat patients happen to be Black, Asian, minority ethnic and therefore die more? Why is it that the nurses who haven't got the right personal protective equipment are Black, Asian, minority ethnics who lose their lives? Why is it the care workers who lost their lives tend to be disproportionately ethnic minorities? Why those who have 0 hours contract, those ethnic minorities, and so forth? So these are structural inequalities that us progressives have to address. And by the way, by doing so, we build resilience for the future and possible further pandemics. And it's really important that we run with this baton that this summer has given us the opportunity to do so. Can I end the debate by saying thank you to Mayor Lightfoot and Manoush for the comments they've made. We've been making notes, and we'll nick your best ideas, then claim them as my own as the election comes next May.
Now, thank you very much. I think, you've been such an excellent panel. You've pretty much covered all of my questions, but I have one very quick question that I would like to raise, if that's okay, before we go on to talk about some ideas pitches. And that is, we've talked quite a lot about what's been happening to people and not enough really about the bottom-up approaches, about what the public want, about how the public are experiencing this pandemic and about their voice. Now, very, very quickly, starting once again with Baroness Shafiq, what role do you think that people should play in this pandemic? And do you think that voice and engagement are going to be crucial in moving ahead in the recovery period?
I think one of the things this crisis has shown us is how we can do events like this and consult all around the world and get ideas from all around the world. And I think this gives us an opportunity to do that in local communities far more quickly, far more efficiently, and hopefully hearing some different voices who wouldn't participate in some of the more kind of formal mechanisms for consultation that lots of organizations and governments do. So I think it's an opportunity to do things differently.
Mayor Khan.
One of the three areas that Manoush talked about was digitalization, and I think we have run with that. So over the course of the last few weeks, we've been engaging with more than 60,000 Londoners on our Talk London platform to hear from Londoners who really don't come to public meetings, don't come to town hall meetings, aren't otherwise on our radar. And the key thing is to listen to people who aren't like-minded. I think we've lost the habit of being challenged and actually spending time outside the echo chamber. And it's really important that we spend more time listening. That's how we engender a sense of buy-in and a sense of ownership of some of the solutions, which I think we need.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mayor Lightfoot, would you like to have the last word?
All right. Briefly, there's an expression in the disability rights community that says, nothing for us without us. We have to engage our residents, and I think all of us have been challenged to engage in much more creative ways. We're seeing numbers of engagement that we've never experienced before because people have the opportunity to connect in digitally. Now, there's still very much a digital divide in my city, but we're seeing a level of interest and engagement that is very productive, helpful, and is going to help us lead into the next phase of our recovery.
Thank you very much, Mayor Khan, Mayor Lightfoot and Baroness Shafiq for your participation. This has been a very exciting discussion, and you've been a delightful panel, and it's been very exciting for me. I mean, I do feel I am in the company of stars. So thank you very much for being a wonderful panel. Now, before we go, I'd like to very quickly introduce 4 idea pitches that are going to be coming up now, 4 idea pitches that were pre-recorded about how we could look at the post-COVID-19 recovery period in a more imaginative way, if you like, and what we should be considering. The first video is by Heather Boushey, who is the president and CEO and co-founder of the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. Heather's video is about laying the foundation for a strong economic recovery characterized by equitable growth. The second video is by Molly Scudder, who is an assistant professor of political science at Purdue University. Molly Scudder's video is going to be on the importance of listening and engaging in politics, something which we've just spoken about. The third video is actually by myself, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how we should be going just beyond the sort of social, economic and health impact of COVID-19, but asking ourselves questions about important issues such as citizenship and how citizenship needs to be more secure. And the last video is by Mayor Don Iverson, who is the mayor of Edmonton, and he's going to talk a lot more about politics and inclusion. Thank you very much, everybody. It's been wonderful for you to join us, and I hope you all stay safe and well for the rest of this year. Many thanks.
Hello, I'm Heather Boushey. I'm President and CEO of the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. High economic inequality is a problem in good times, but it is particularly stark in this crisis. In the United States, it has amplified the severity of both the pandemic as well as the economic downturn. For decades, policymakers and economists alike have put their faith in the idea that markets are the best and only way for our economy to deliver what's needed for sustained economic growth and well-being. This promise has not delivered. We've seen economic resources become increasingly concentrated among those at the top of the income and wealth ladder. And we've seen how this concentration of resources transforms into social and political power among an elite few. Still, we pretend that the rules that govern markets are always neutral and fair. But allowing markets to determine outcomes has shifted economic risk towards people and families, and away from the institutions that could better bear them. Our economic competitors have fared better than we because they have effective institutions. At the same time, we in the United States have reduced the risks for those at the top, including big corporations. At no time has this been more apparent than right now. Today, many of the workers most likely to be in jobs with a high degree of face-to-face contact with the public, jobs like the restaurant staff who prepare our food, and the healthcare workers who care for us when we are sick, are at greater risk of exposure to the coronavirus. They are also less likely to have access to paid sick time or employer-provided health insurance. Meanwhile, if you're in a job where you can telecommute, you're also more likely to have the best insurance coverage and the most generous workplace benefits. In other words, the deck is stacked. This is what inequality looks like, and it plays out across gender, across race and income level. When Wall Street gets a cold, Harlem gets pneumonia. Death rates are higher in communities of color, in no small part due to structural racism, segregation, and industrial policy. This is on top of underlying health inequalities due to a failure to invest in ensuring all communities have access to high-quality and affordable health care. And it's clear that the jobs that make it possible for those with families to go to work every day, childcare centers, schools, nursing homes, are also heavily staffed by women and are among the least paid. Because of these underlying structural fragilities, the economic crisis is being felt more dramatically in the United States than in our economic competitors. Congress allowed critical legislation providing support to families and small businesses to expire, and it is exacerbating already historic levels of inequality. If large businesses continue to receive seamless and generous help during the coronavirus recession, but small businesses are left with laggard or inadequate assistance, we will see increases in already severe levels of economic inequality, including wealth disparities by race, ethnicity, and gender. And we will see consolidation and concentration across firms, which will hurt small business owners, consumers, and workers. Unless policymakers actively address these structural issues, the United States will experience continued increases in income and wealth inequality amid the coronavirus recession and coming out of it. This is exactly what happened after the Great Recession, when the U.S. economy lost 8.7 million jobs and $12 trillion in total household net worth. The wealthiest 1% emerged stronger than ever. They regained what they had lost by 2012. That year, their inflation-adjusted average wealth, not including any funds hidden in overseas accounts, was $13.8 million, just 3.5% below the 2007 peak. Middle-class families, meanwhile, were still recovering in March of this year. The role of policy changes in arranging our market structure are unmistakable and enduring. We must seek to enact policies that contain inequality at the top and provide counterweights to concentrated economic power, not amplify it. And we must ask tough questions to make the tough choices. Will we again choose to bail out Wall Street rather than Main Street? Or will we use antitrust enforcement agencies to ensure small businesses have a chance? Will we make it easier or harder to join a union? Will we make sure no worker has to show up for work sick or in fear for their health, and that if you need care, you'll have access to it? These are the critical policy questions facing the United States, ones that require we confront economic inequality and all it has done to our economy and our society. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Molly Scudder. I'm an assistant professor of political science at Purdue University. Today I'm going to talk about how we go about building a more inclusive society. What does it mean to really be included? All of us here today have been included in a very important conversation. We have been given a seat at the table. But meaningful inclusion requires more than simply giving people the opportunity to voice their opinions. They must also have some assurance that their voices will be heard and their ideas considered. In my book, Beyond Empathy and Inclusion, The Challenge of Listening in Democratic Deliberation, I show how the success of efforts to expand inclusion, whether in government, the academy, or the workplace, depend in large part on our practices of listening. In this presentation, I will explain the link between inclusion and listening and discuss how we can establish a more inclusive society by renewing our commitment to listening. How do we achieve inclusion in societies characterized by growing inequality, deep disagreement, and conditions of social distance, when people may have little in common and even less opportunity to interact? Efforts to expand inclusion do not always translate into democratic gains. And that's because what makes the inclusion of new and diverse perspectives so valuable is precisely what makes them difficult for those with relative privilege and power to understand or even hear. Unless we consider how to promote better listening, strategies to expand inclusion will be meaningless. Conventional wisdom and a fair bit of academic research holds that deep differences and disagreement among citizens create obstacles for democracy. The assumption is that differences must be overcome, often through empathy, in order for citizens to engage productively with one another. Take this panel, for example, on the topic of building inclusive societies and strengthening our social fabric. We think of the fabric of our society as being frayed. We want to strengthen it. There are divides. We want to bridge them. Empathy, or imagining yourself in another's shoes, is seen as a way to enhance inclusion by bridging divides between citizens, by showing us that we are not so different in the end. I want to challenge this thinking. Indeed, I want to suggest that in order to build a truly inclusive society, we must work past this assumption. The first problem with empathy is that we're generally pretty bad at it. Empathy is mediated by commonality, and we empathize most easily with people who are like us in a way that others aren't. Rather than helping overcome divisions, empathy can actually reinforce them. Second, investing too much energy in promoting empathy can distract us from the difficult yet necessary task of actually listening to others. Why would I engage in an uncomfortable conversation with someone if I could just imagine how I would feel in their shoes? Rather than assuming that we have to resolve conflict in order to achieve inclusive societies, we are better off trying to encourage citizens to accept and become more comfortable with some level of disagreement. The idea here is that we can do greater damage to our social fabric by trying to patch every fray. We may never get to a consensus, and that's okay. It's more important that we keep the conversation going and make sure people who disagree feel welcome expressing their disagreement. Thus, to capture the democratic benefits of inclusion, we must prepare citizens for the fact that their interactions are likely to uncover profound and even incompatible differences. We also need to create more opportunities for political elites and representatives to listen to citizens, especially from marginalized groups. One option would be to invest in deliberative town halls, where representatives meet with a randomly selected group of their constituents for about 30 minutes of questions and answers. Research has shown the immense interest people have in participating in these conversations with their representatives and fellow citizens. Really listening to others, especially those with whom we disagree, is hard, and it's just as likely to reveal disagreement as it is to reveal some underlying agreement or commonality. Also, inclusion often means giving voice not only to the historically excluded, but to democracy's enemies and those who seek to exclude. Still, it is only in listening to what others have to say that we can determine those ideas we ought to reject in the first place. I want to conclude by emphasizing that listening isn't the answer to all of our problems, and it is not a silver bullet. Listening will not always make cooperation easier, but without it, we aren't really achieving meaningful inclusion. I look forward to hearing the panelists' comments.
Why is race still a risk factor in the 21st century? Whether it was the merciless killing of George Floyd in the US or the disproportionate deaths of Black and ethnic minority people during COVID-19, or the detention and deportation of British Black citizens in the UK, the reality for Black and ethnic minority people is always the same, which is because of the colour of their skin, their lives, their life chances, their life outcomes are always much more insecure, conditional, and precarious in Western societies. Now, we have learnt in the last year through COVID-19, through the Black Lives Matter protests, that racism has deeply insidious implications and outcomes. We know to a great extent that racism is also about a matter of life chances and life and death. But what we don't talk about much is how racism is also inculcated into the very foundations of our citizenship, that citizenship depends on the colour of our skin. We don't talk about this other than, of course, last year when Donald Trump raised this controversial discussion about abolishing birthright citizenship in the US. As expected, this was met with widespread dismay and outrage because we see birthright citizenship to be the most fundamental human right that we have and the most fundamental ingredient for inclusive societies. And yet here we are in the UK, and not many people know this, but we don't have birthright citizenship. Birthright citizenship was removed by Margaret Thatcher in 1983 through the British Nationality Act. Margaret Thatcher removed birthright citizenship not because she was thinking about equalising rights for everybody, not because she wanted to improve citizenship, but because she was concerned about Britain being swamped by immigrants, about immigrants coming in and flooding Britain. She used, interestingly, the same terms that Enoch Powell used in his famous Rivers of Blood speech in 1968. Now, the important thing is we need to go back to the basics. We need to go back to the basics and look at birthright citizenship when we think about racism, when we think about rectifying the imbalance of inequalities between Black and ethnic minority group and white people, because citizenship is not straightforward. We have seen in the UK, in the US, across the world, that if citizenship is conditional, if citizenship is adapted in little ways where if you are not native, if you are not white, that your citizenship is more precarious, then it has deeply insidious and long-lasting impacts on Black and ethnic minority people. In the UK, we saw that when the government, through their hostile environment policies under Theresa May a few years ago, in 2016, when she introduced her hostile immigration policies, that Black and ethnic minority people and Windrush citizens, Black Windrush citizens, were much more insecure because they didn't have the identity documents that the government now required if you were to start a new job or to access the NHS or to rent a house. Citizens, Windrush generation, Black British citizens suddenly found themselves detained and even deported to other countries, even though they had spent their entire lives in this country. We need to go back to the basics and ask ourselves, is citizenship equal for Black and ethnic minority people and white people in the US, in the UK, in Canada, and across Western societies? And in the UK, we need to reintroduce birthright citizenships so that Black and ethnic minority citizens are not treated as second-class citizens. There's a lot to be done. We need to review the costs of citizenship. We need to reintroduce birthright citizenship. We need to look at citizenship for children. There are so many issues for concern. Inclusive societies are not just about outcomes in the criminal justice system, in education, employment, and other areas. It's also about our citizenship rights to be here. And unless we have secure citizenship, everything else pales into comparison. Because unless we have secure citizenship, we will constantly be wondering whether we can be detained and deported to countries we've never known. Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me to speak today. This conversation is coming at a critical moment as we look ahead to recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. In Canada and around the world, it's local governments that are on the front lines of this pandemic, and residents are depending on us to keep frontline services going strong. Everything from local fire and ambulance to garbage collection to clean water to protecting our most vulnerable citizens. In cities across this country, people who were already marginalized have been living on the knife's edge during this pandemic. In our temporary shelters, on the streets, facing enormous challenges with physical distancing and staying safe. So to take action to address these issues, Canadian cities have been working closely with our federal government through the Federation of Canadian Municipalities to shape Canada's national pandemic response. And most importantly, working alongside our federal and provincial counterparts, we were instrumental in driving the recent Safe Restart funding agreement. This agreement provides crucial upfront relief for the municipal financial crisis that threatens those frontline services that Canadians rely on, and provides more support for vulnerable populations. Now, what's clear as we look forward to recovery is that a return to the status quo simply isn't enough. What's needed now is a different approach, a bold and creative recovery plan that brings our country back stronger than ever. Canadian mayors envision a future that's more prosperous, more resilient, and more connected. And at its core, this Canada must be inclusive so that every community and every Canadian has the opportunity to thrive. Nobody knows better how an inclusive society can improve the lives of Canadians than municipal leaders. We see every day the challenges facing vulnerable people and families facing rent hikes or eviction, or those Canadians dealing with substance use disorders. Fixing these challenges will require unprecedented collaboration among orders of government, with cities directly at the table. From public libraries to affordable housing to transit, the infrastructure and services municipalities provide help ensure all Canadians can participate fully in our economy with the quality of life each of us deserves. It's the foundation of the livable and inclusive communities we strive to build. Scaling up federal infrastructure funding will enable cities to get job-creating projects off the ground faster, while making our communities more livable and inclusive for years to come. But few things impact our prosperity more than a decent roof over one's head. And so even before COVID-19, Canadians faced a housing affordability crisis, a growing disconnect between rents, home prices, and income levels. It's a crisis that limits prosperity and exacerbates inequality. National Housing Strategy, launched in 2017, was a game-changing initiative, and this is no time to dial it back. The pandemic, in fact, presents an opportunity to continue to make ambitious inroads into tackling this country's housing crisis, from accelerating funding to increasing flexibility. Filling gaps in the National Housing Strategy means securing the foundation for tomorrow's livable, inclusive, and sustainable and more just Canada. During this pandemic, those without housing faced the biggest challenges with social distancing, while households that struggled to pay rent before have since lost income, and they now face even greater risk. Paradoxically, the pandemic has also created a once-in-a-generation opportunity. Private landlords struggle, and some hotels close due to significant drops in tourism. Some of these properties will come up for sale at below market prices. And that's why last week, FCM put forward a bold proposal to acquire and repair these properties and transform them into affordable and supportive housing for those experiencing homelessness. But we need to act fast. Cities urgently need new permanent supportive housing units to replace costly temporary shelters. And not only would this help ground more Canadians in a home they can afford, this approach would be more cost-effective in the long run and create recovery-boosting jobs. Now, of course, infrastructure and housing are not the only building blocks of a more prosperous, livable, and inclusive post-COVID Canada. And as we saw this spring, our transit systems were there for essential workers. During the pandemic, more than half of Canada's transit riders have been women. 80% do not own a car, and half earn less than a living wage. So this is a critical moment for transit systems around the world. We can't let the impacts that the pandemic has had on ridership and transit revenue lead to long-term service reductions and an erosion of the systems we're building. Through FCM, we've secured emergency operating funding that will stave off the worst of the financial impacts, at least for this year. But going forward, it will be critical that we work together to ensure that public transit systems remain financially viable during and beyond the pandemic. Now is not the time to hold back on ambitious capital projects either. Modern and affordable transit is a backbone of livable cities before and after the pandemic, as well as critical to our climate strategy. Now, the federal government has committed to establish a permanent transit fund that will enable the next generation of transformational transit projects to proceed. In the near term, the recovery period presents an ideal opportunity to accelerate the transition to zero-emission transit vehicles that support more manufacturing jobs while reducing carbon emissions further and faster. Canada's federal municipal partnership has made tremendous progress in recent years. Now, together, we face our greatest challenge yet, but also our biggest opportunity to emerge from COVID-19 stronger than ever. We've seen what orders of government can do and are capable of when we work together. And municipal leaders, as always, are ready to work as partners, and we're ready to get to work because we're still all in this together.
Well, thank you all very much for sharing those ideas and those pitches with us. And I'd like to also once again thank the panelists for their very interesting, frank and honest conversation about the challenges that they're facing. I think it's fair to say the LSE, Chicago and London are well served right now with some very strong leadership, and it's reassuring, and it was a real privilege to hear that conversation and to hear some of those ideas and some of their experience firsthand. So thank you to all the panelists and to those who shared their pitches. That will wrap up the program for today. The summit will return tomorrow morning at 9:30 Eastern. So we look forward to seeing everybody back with us tomorrow to tackle sustainability and democracy and institutions. So we are going to look forward to welcoming Frans Timmermans, the first Vice President of the European Commission, to co-chair the sustainability panel, and Helle Thorning-Schmidt, the former Prime Minister of Denmark, who will lead the conversation on democracy and institutions. So lots to look forward to there. We also have some wonderful speakers who will be joining us tomorrow, including Catherine McKenna, the Canadian Minister for Infrastructure and Communities, John Podesta, founder of the Center for American Progress, Sandro Guzzi, member of the European Parliament with Renew Europe, and Don Nakagawa, Executive Vice President of the Berggruen Institute. And they will be joined by many others as well. So lots to look forward to tomorrow. For the full agenda, you can visit www.recoveryproject.org, and all the information is there. Thank you once again for your participation today. Have a safe and enjoyable rest of the day, whatever time it may be where you are. Thank you very much.